You ready?
Big prayer.
You
I've been praying all week. I've run out.
Well, good morning. Thank you everybody for being here this morning. It's a little past 10. We're going to go ahead and get started. I believe we have Senator Strickland has joined us online. Good morning, Senator Strickland.
Morning, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you for being with us this morning. We've got a full agenda. Should be a lot of good information. So Senator Halpern is in DC speaking to at a conference there. I think Senator Anabatardi may be on a well-deserved vacation, but he possibly will join us via Zoom or whatever system we use. But we're going to get started this morning. I want to open us up with a word of prayer. If you would please bow with me. Heavenly Father, we thank you for all the blessings you give us. We thank you for this wonderful state we live in and all the fine people that make this state the great state it is, Lord. Thank you for the elected officials here today and joining us online. Thank you for the time and commitment they have to the people of Georgia. Thank you for the advocates here in the room and the staff. Please bless them, bless their families, and Lord, help us to remember that you are in control and that we need to follow you. And I hope what we do today will be pleasing to you, Lord, and keep everyone safe as they travel home. In Christ's name, amen. Okay, we got a packed agenda. I think 6 people on the agenda to present. I'd ask the presenters to please try to keep your presentation or remarks to about 20 minutes, and that will leave us a little time for questions at the end. We're going to get through this as expeditiously as we can, but it's important information. So I don't want to rush too much. I have I have lunch coming in at noon, and we're going to just take a brief break at noon for lunch, and basically 15-20 minutes and get back at it. I want to thank Emily Yona and Impact for sponsoring our lunch today. Where's Emily? Thank you, Emily. My first order of business, I have a new legislative assistant. I'm very excited about her joining our team, Mackenzie Rhodes. So raise your hand, Mackenzie. And she started last week, so she's already been thrown into the fire and has done a great job getting us ready for this meeting today and getting us organized. We're looking forward to working with Mackenzie, and I just wanted everybody to know her and connect with her and put a name with a face too. Our first speaker is Mark Hayden with R Street Institute. Mark has become a good friend of mine, and we have had hours of discussion on occupational licensing, and he has some very good ideas and has been very helpful to me. So, Mark, I will turn it over to you.
Members of the committee, thank you so much for inviting me to testify. My name is Mark Hayden, and I'm the Director of State Government Affairs at the R Street Institute, which is a free market think tank that supports limited effective government in many areas, including in occupational licensing. And today I'm hoping to provide the study committee with an overview of the issues plaguing occupational licensing here in Georgia, previous attempts at fixing it, and a few possible options for improving it a little bit further. By way of background, policymakers thankfully have worked very hard to keep Georgia the best place to do business, but addressing the state's occupational licensing flaws have proven difficult, leading to burdensome overregulation that hurts Georgians in the end. To date, there are over 40 licensing boards housed under the Secretary of State, and the state licenses over 140 professions, including librarians, pre-need cemetery salespeople, and even auctioneers. But these mandates, they come with serious restrictions. They require prospective workers to clear various hurdles in order to get the government's permission to earn a living. According to a 2022 report, Georgia's mandates for lower income professions require on average $197 in fees, 472 days of education and experience, and around 2 exams. These requirements, they represent daunting barriers, making it difficult for individuals to obtain employment. And the most recent report from the Institute for Justice ranked Georgia's occupational licensing paradigm for lower level income professions as the country's 12th most burdensome. But I do want to be clear and ensure that policymakers are clear that those pursuing moderate to even higher level income professions likewise face needlessly difficult barriers to entry. And while supporters of occupational licensing or increased licensing regulation, they often justify it as necessary to protect consumers from unqualified and unscrupulous workers. But these laws, they risk inflicting serious harm on underprivileged individuals, as well as the broader economy. Despite many alternatives to licensing existing, from mandatory inspections and mandatory insurance and bonding, or even market competition, licensing and its burdens have proliferated. In 1950, scarcely 5% of workers needed a license to earn a living in the United States. And today that number is closer to 30%. And this surge in regulation, it comes with some serious consequences. Raising the bar to obtain permission to work limits labor participation, increases consumer prices, curtails competition within industries, and often lacks any benefit to the general public. Research has shown that in these impediments may result in 3 million fewer jobs across the United States. And by reducing competition and increasing licensing qualifications, consumer prices are driven up, maybe by around 3 to 16%. And the total number annually may be more than $200 billion. And I'm sure it's much more than that if we factor in inflation since that study was completed. But studies have also questioned how effectively licensing regulations benefit the public. A study on the dental industry found that increased requirements do not necessarily lead to better outcomes. And even the Obama administration, which was not particularly known for supporting reduced regulation, admitted in a report that, quote, most empirical evidence does not find that stricter licensing requirements improve quality, public safety, or health, end quote. Georgia's model bears all of the flaws of hallmarks of a flawed system, and as evidenced by recent hearings, workers grapple with unnecessarily high licensing mandates, and they struggle to obtain a license in a timely fashion. Even after submitting a complete satisfactory application, applicants can wait months for government approval, which leaves them unemployed or underemployed due to a slow-moving government apparatus. But I do want to be clear that none of this is to say that occupational licensing is inherently bad and that occupations should be delicensed wholesale. I'm not here to say that. Certainly, we want our doctors, we want our engineers to be qualified and licensed, but licensing as a whole, I think, needs to be improved. The challenges posed by occupational licensing here in Georgia, thankfully, have not been lost on lawmakers. Over the past several years, legislators have worked to improve the system in many ways. Georgia enacted interstate licensure compacts to create avenues for out-of-state workers to more quickly and easily get approval to work here in Georgia, but they come with limitations. Georgia's interstate compacts are limited to a select number of occupations, particularly related to the medical industry, and the agreements don't include all states. But we have made headway in other areas, and I'm pleased that R Street was involved in each of these bills intimately. In 2019, Governor Kemp signed into law Senate Bill 214, which forbade the licensing boards from suspending individuals' licenses simply because they fell behind on student loans. In 2020, he approved a measure to create an expedited process to essentially recognize the out-of-state licenses of military spouses in good standing who moved to Georgia. And in 2021, he gave the nod to a bill that increases the time that veterans have to qualify for a license based on their military expertise. 2023 is a bit of a banner year for Georgia. Lawmakers passed House Bill 155, which is a landmark bill that builds off of the Military Spouse Licensure Act in that it directs licensing boards to offer licensure by endorsement to qualifying individuals, including non-military spouses, who hold an out-of-state license in good standing and move to Georgia. And in addition, this very study committee demonstrates the Senate's keen interest in continuing to address Georgia's licensing woes, and candidly, there are quite a few. Perhaps one of the most important topics that I believe would be incredibly valuable for the committee to consider is ensuring that individual occupational licensing standards are not unduly burdensome, are no more difficult to obtain than the national average, and that vague criminal history language and criminal backgrounds don't prevent the issuance of a license, like Senator Strickland's bill, whom I know is on the line. However, that's different testimony for a different day. Today, I'd like to focus more on the governance of occupational licensing. In order for the government apparatus supporting licensing regimes, licensing boards, the Professional Licensing Board division, to be customer service oriented, provide timely service, and more effectively serve Georgians, some reforms are certainly needed to provide capacity. It's clear that many industries have been displeased with the PLBD for years. Recently, the engineers and land surveyors worked to be removed from the PLBD. Nurses, foresters, and veterinarians, and perhaps even others have likewise pursued measures to be released from the PLBD. And they've raised some valid concerns, but they can't all be pinned on the PLBD. After all, it's been grossly underfunded, in my opinion. In fiscal year 2007, the Georgia General Assembly allocated the PLBD around $11.5 million to operate. Today, it receives less than $9 million. But licensing fees generate around $25 million a year, which is how most states fund the regulation of licensing, occupational licensing regimes. They don't intend for the vast majority of the fees to go to support other programs, which is largely what happens here in Georgia. But despite this, had the PLBD's funding steadily increased with state population growth and inflation from 2007, then it would receive almost $19 million today, which is much closer to the revenue it generates from licensing fees. And I'm saying all this as a fiscal conservative. Without the appropriate funding, it's challenging to staff the PLBD adequately and provide prospective workers with the timely support that they need. To be clear, though, the PLBD's funding does not bear all of the blame. Specific licensing boards also contribute to occupational licensing's dysfunction. As has been outlined, I'm sure, many times in House Regulated Industries Committee, and certainly recently, some licensing boards, they don't meet regularly. Others meet quarterly. And in fact, Georgia law permits many licensing boards to meet as little as one time a year. This can create uncertainty, backlogs, and long wait times for applicants to be approved to work and have complaints settled. But extended periods of unemployment or underemployment can be devastating to people and their families. So as such, I would recommend that lawmakers consider mandating that licensing boards meet on regular intervals with no more than 30 days passing in between each licensing board meeting, if and only if they have pending business. If there's no work to do, there's no need to convene. But along the same vein, it's important to ensure that applicants aren't held in limbo for extended periods of time either. If licensing boards meet every 30 days and the PLBD is either more adequately funded or able to leverage technology to be more efficient in the licensing business, then there's no reason why licensing applications shouldn't be approved or rejected within 30 days of receipt of a complete application and proof of passage of all exams. Now, in the prior committee hearing, we heard about some issues that could trip up a 30-day shot clock. We've heard about other government agencies, other governments perhaps not providing all the necessary information within a timely fashion. Perhaps we would have to include some sort of exclusions for those cases, or alternatively, we could just have the applicant sign an affidavit attesting that they are in good standing, and then they could get a provisional license by endorsement until that delayed information is obtained. In fairness, it's not their fault that this information is not coming through. It's other governments, presumably, that are causing this issue. But a 30-day time frame, this is not out of the realm of possibility. Other states have already enacted 30-day shot clocks for military spouse applications. Kentucky, Missouri, North Dakota, Ohio, South Dakota, and perhaps others have already done this. Georgia, we set ours at 60 days, which I fear may be too long and it should be shorter. But regardless of what shot clock we settle on, it does nothing for current Georgians, and it does nothing for non-military families who move here and need to get an occupational license. There's reason to believe that a 30-day window could work here, as I alluded to. In the prior committee hearing, the deputy director of licensing boards explained that with regard to military spouse and military applications, they begin to work on those applications within 3 days of receipt, and, quote, most of our applications are issued within 5 to 10 days, end quote. That's fantastic. But we should probably be doing that for everyone. We have to take care. I understand we must take care of our military spouses, but at the same time, we need to take care of Georgians as well. And I would like to see us consider enacting a 30-day shot clock for the approval or rejection of licensing applications. And I think this would remove a lot of the uncertainty that exists in this process. I do want to be clear that if this is something that the legislature considers, that the shot clock should not begin until a fully completed application with proof of passage of all exams has been submitted and received. And lastly, I think we should consider revisiting licensure by endorsement. This was something I worked very hard on with the legislature. Lawmakers have enacted this process in order to make it easier for out-of-state license holders to be able to get to work here in Georgia, including non-military spouses. And this represented an important leap forward in Georgia's licensing system, in my opinion, but a few provisions within it could certainly be improved. Right now, in order to qualify for licensure by endorsement, individuals must establish residency in Georgia. And at first blush, that probably appears prudent, but this effectively prevents those who live just over the state line in any of our border states from taking advantage of licensure by endorsement. So if you have a Tennessee license and you live in Chattanooga, but your job for whatever reason is transferred to Ringgold, Georgia, you cannot take advantage of licensure by endorsement. You have to start the traditional licensing process anew, which can be a timely, costly, and perhaps even confusing ordeal. And the same can be said for those who may have to work on contracts, perhaps temporarily in Georgia, or even theoretically, I believe it could even work for emergency workers. Right now, they cannot take advantage of licensure by endorsement. Simply removing that residency requirement, I think, would solve that problem. But there is one last tweak to this that I would like to talk about. To be awarded licensure by endorsement, an individual in Georgia must hold, quote, a current license to practice such occupation or profession issued by another state for which the training, experience, and testing are substantially similar in qualifications and scope to the requirements under this state. However, in the prior hearing, we also heard about this. This standard, as it relates to military spouses, is in conflict with federal law that was passed earlier this year. That law, that standard, requires Georgia to recognize out-of-state military spouse licenses if they're in a, quote, similar scope of practice and in the discipline applied for in the jurisdiction of such new residency. This is a completely different standard, and in fact, it shows that the standard that we have enacted in Georgia is stricter than the federal standard that's being levied on us. And put simply, I think it's important to consider aligning our standard with the federal government's for military spouses and anyone who has an out-of-state license in good standing and wants to work here. And if we did adopt this standard, it would put us in line with what some other states have already done, states, I believe, like Utah and Arizona. In closing, Georgia, like much of the rest of the country, is facing some very severe workforce shortages and a possible recession in the coming months. And one of the surest ways to ease these issues and let Georgia's economy continue to thrive is to curtail unnecessary government impediments to employment. And thankfully, we have the study committee, and hopefully that'll let us begin by addressing occupational licensing. And with that, I appreciate your time. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to try to field them.
Thank you very much, Mark. So we have the former Chairman Powell from Camilla that we miss very much. He was keen on dedicated fees, and we did move in that direction a good bit under his leadership. That seems to kind of be the concept on the licensing fees? I mean, clearly it looks like the licensing fees are much of them are going to the general fund. Is that
PLBD, I believe, gets about $8.5 million, but in licensing fees generate about 24 to 25. So they get to keep about 1/3 of it for what it's actually intended to be used for.
on your point about the having a shot clock, I think 60 days is too long. The 30 days, if you require the PLDB boards to meet monthly if they have business before them, did we ever, I know you and I've talked about this, but did we determine that they already are allowed in the code to meet virtually?
The Open Meetings Act permits that, yes.
So,
But the chairman is the one who decides when and where they meet, I believe. So if he or she chooses to do virtual, it's perfectly legal to do.
so that's not a barrier to meeting
No,
more
sir.
frequently. Travel and the expense of travel, et cetera,
Mhm.
shouldn't be a barrier for
Correct.
that. If we went with 30 days and they only do meet every 30 days and you applied on, I mean, is 30 days, I'm for 30 days. Is it realistic as far as, if you just miss the meeting, then it's going to be 30 days before they meet again. Would 40 days make more sense maybe, or 45, or many of these licenses should be able to be issued without the licensing board having to act on it, correct?
It depends on the licensing board, and I would defer to the wisdom of the committee to decide what length of shot clock they would recommend. But certainly 30 days is working in other states for military spouses, and I think that means that we could probably replicate that for everyone who's wanting to get a license or a license by endorsement to work here. But again, I would defer to the wisdom of the committee.
That's a bad call.
Mark, do you have a general feel for which licensing boards? It seems like the staff in Macon, to me, if an application comes in and it's complete and they have all the necessary information and there's no complaints against that applicant, any prior problems, felonies or whatever, it seems like the staff ought to be able to issue the license without the board having to act on that. Do you have a feel for how many boards do it that way versus boards that actually want to approve every single application?
I don't know how many. I know some of the boards are able to set some of their own rules and how they act. But when I was perusing Title 43 yesterday, there's some that certainly they retain the right to approve and reject licensing applications. But they also have shared support. When you apply for a license in Georgia, the PLBD has full-time staff, analysts, and everything, lawyers, to help support them in their decision. So I would presume that once it gets to them and they have discussion, then the licensing board, if they decide to retain that right, that privilege, they're the rubber stamp that finally ensures that this person can get an occupational license. But then you also have the realtors, and I believe that they've decided to go in a bit of a different direction because I think they approve most of their licenses within 24 hours.
Okay. Speak a little bit more to your idea about the affidavit. If we're waiting on a criminal, one of the things we heard at the first meeting that we had in Macon was, well, the delay is because it's taken us longer than 30 days to get a criminal background check, the information back on that. And I'm in the insurance profession, and I've actually experienced when we try to get appointed with a new insurance carrier, they do a criminal background check on me and some of my staff, and it has been taking way longer than it used to for whatever. I don't really know why, but I mean, it's been taking sometimes 2 and 3 months. But the affidavit idea, drill down on that a little bit. I just want to kind of emphasize that as
Sure.
I think that's a real good solution to this issue with delays on the criminal background check.
Well, waiting 2 to 3 months when you have children and you need to put food on the table is an awful long time to be unemployed. But yes, I don't know why NCIC, that process is not working as quickly. I mean, I'm sure we have access to GCIC terminals, but that's only going to help you with Georgia criminal histories. So we obviously need to check the NCIC on for out-of-state licenses, especially. But I think the solution here is really simple. Right now, you apply for it and you have to do that background check, but it's not your fault if the government, for some reason, is not providing the information. You've already done your work to provide a valid, complete, satisfactory licensing application. So we could include in the licensing application an affidavit under oath. It would be perjury if you lied on it, and I guess that perhaps even criminal penalties or civil penalties for violating that. And you could just state that you are in good standing. So if we're looking at, if there are states, for instance, that are withholding information or just not providing it as quickly enough, whether or not they have a prospective out-of-state license holder has some sort of complaint against them in a board in another state, we could have them sign an affidavit stating, no, there are no complaints, I am still in good standing, and then also include within that affidavit, no, I don't have any felonies or whatever the requirements are for that said license, saying that they are in good standing, whether it's with complaints or the criminal backgrounds, sign it. And I think from that point, you could either give them a license or a license by endorsement, or at least one that's provisional until the delayed information can be obtained, and then it becomes formal and finalized.
Okay, thank you. And I'll get you in a second. The residency requirement, you explained why that's a barrier, and we all know, and I think we would all agree in this room, that we have a workforce shortage. And the governor and his economic development team have been extremely successful in growing the jobs we have, growing the industries we already have, and bringing in new industry. I don't know where all the workforce is going to come from. Frankly, it's just amazing the growth we're seeing. So I get what you said. That makes a lot of sense to me on the border states, especially where we have a shortage of maybe even EMTs. If somebody was in Chattanooga and wanted to work in North Georgia, that's a burden. What is the argument? Why is the residency requirement in there? Do you know the history of that? And
yes,
and is there an argument for requiring residency?
I think this is probably a holdover from the initial military spouse licensing bill that I worked on, because if you're trying to qualify for a military spouse occupational license, the expedited licensure by endorsement, by relocating here, we wanted to have something in there to prove, oh, well, they're relocating here, that's why they need this benefit. But I think we've seen that this is a good benefit for everyone. So to remove that residency requirement, I think would help them, and it could help other military spouses. I mean, if that military spouse is relocated to, say, the tri-state area, Alabama, Georgia, and Tennessee, they still may need to work across state lines as well. And I think this would help them, as well as anyone that wants to try to fill some of our workforce shortages.
If they earn income in Georgia, whether or not they're a resident, they still would be subject to Georgia income tax, correct? I'm
going to defer to the committee on all tax questions.
I wondered if that maybe if it was an income tax issue.
We need to look at that.
Okay.
I think there's a gap.
I've always been told if you don't ask a question you don't know the answer to, but this is true. This is truly a study committee. I mean, we're trying to figure it out. Anyway, all right. That's thank you, Mark. And I know
Thank you.
Senator Dugan has some questions or comments.
Thank you. Again, this is a study committee, so we're studying here. Your second background slide, 200 billion. It looks like we're talking about Georgia law, but this looks like all U.S. stats. Am I reading that correctly? starts with a licensing drives up consumer costs, perhaps 3 to 16%.
Yeah, yes, those are national statistics.
Okay. So I'm going to go to the increased capacity slide. How many jobs within the Secretary of State's office that's responsible for this are not filled right now?
Oh, that would be, I wouldn't be able to answer that question. I'd have to ask the Secretary of State's office.
It's unlike Senator Walker, I have a little bit of an issue with not having the flexibility of funding when as needed. I think that we ought to have a closer ratio than what we are showing right now. But anytime you tie your hands, you get somebody fat and happy and somebody starving to death and no ability to swap where needed. So the rheostat principle and budgeting. So if we're not using that money to hire any more people to make them more effective, then I don't see why the money's an issue on that one. So we'll figure that one out. Many boards meet as little as once a year.
Many boards are empowered to or permitted to meet as little as once a year. I don't have the numbers for when all of them do. And in fact, some of them meet on irregular intervals, is my understanding from different hearings that I've been a part of.
Well, if we found a board that only met once a year, that's a board that we could probably do away with.
I would agree.
Okay. And again, I understand what you're saying. This licensure by endorsement, especially on border areas, got to be very, very careful about that, because believe it or not, there are humans out there that will game the system and states that will game the system as well. So we're talking EMTs, and now, as you remember last year, short duration EMTs can cross state lines in Alabama, the border states. I think that was Senator Strickland's bill. Anyway, you're talking a little bit longer term, and I understand that. We just got to be careful on that we don't create an open environment here where entities from another state are coming in to do work in the state, but going back and paying their income taxes and everything in their home state and putting our people out of work within the state.
And I'd be happy to work with you on this.
Okay, thank you. And your second licensure by endorsement slide, state law and federal law. Are you talking about the compacts?
No, sir. This is just for licensure by endorsement. To qualify for it, you would have to meet that specific standard. And the standard has changed at the federal level, which mandates that all licensing boards in every state abide by that. So we're kind of out of alignment right now.
Okay. I understand what you're saying there. And as a retired military guy, I appreciate all the benefits that we had for that we've put in place over the years for the spouses. But Georgia law in different areas is different than Alabama law, which is different than Tennessee law, which is different than Illinois law. That's the reason they have to take the licensure requirements, the testing, everything in the state. You're not talking about doing away with the testing.
They don't have to take the testing now. What testing they have to take if they are from a state that is deemed substantially similar, they only have to take the portion of the test that particularly pertains to Georgia state law, but the national stuff, they wouldn't have to take that.
In some cases. But if I'm a general contractor and I want to have my GC license in Florida, I have to take my GC license in Florida, because the construction code in Florida is different than the construction code in Georgia. There are other entities out there that similar type situations come up where just because your skill set may be the same, and you're right, there are some where you don't have to, but that's what I'm saying. We just got to be careful that we don't do a blanket across the board when there are differences in state laws and from other state to state.
To clarify, I try to simplify this for the slides and for the presentation, but there's more to the code than that. So there is a section in Georgia code now, which I would suggest that it stay, where it says you have to take whatever testing requirements that are required that are particularly related to Georgia.
Yeah,
absolutely. I don't think we want, the state law differs so much from state to state.
Thank you.
Now, Colonel Dugan, I attributed the dedicated fees to Chairman Jay Powell. I did not say that was my view 100%. I was not endorsing that. I don't want to give away our ability to appropriate and to be flexible with our budget process. I just was saying.
About you, I was talking about Representative Powell.
Chairman Strickland, do you have any questions?
No, I'm good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The bill he mentioned that you might have been involved with, does that ring a bell?
No, I know you mentioned Senate Bill 157 on criminal records, but I think Chairman Dugan gave me too much credit for the other issue.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Chairman.
All right, our next presenter is gonna join us virtually, Mr. Austin Bannon. He's an employment policy fellow with Americans for Prosperity. Good morning, Austin.
Hi, are you able to hear me well?
Yes, and we can see you and hear you. Thank you
All
for being with us. Go ahead.
Well, I appreciate it, Chairman Walker and all members of the committee. I guess I'm in the right place if you mentioned enjoying hours of discussion about occupational licensing. Not easy to get that everywhere, but it's a particular pleasure to do this. I do work with Americans for Prosperity at the headquarters in Northern Virginia and try to work on licensing reform and other labor reforms across every state. But I grew up in Gwinnett County and am a graduate of University of Georgia. So it's always a particular pleasure when I can help out and make an appearance here in the state of Georgia, and wanted to at least be virtually at the Capitol with my background. So I really appreciate this opportunity.
Go Dogs.
Go Dogs. And I believe you can now see my presentation. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Yes,
Okay.
sir, we can.
Okay.
Turn his volume up a little bit if you would. Hold. Thank you. Go ahead, sir.
Okay, sure.
Go ahead.
Okay, well, I just, we'll dive right into the occupational licensing and not discuss much of our broader labor platform, but we're really committed to workforce flexibility, trying to allow businesses and individuals to have more opportunities to enter the career paths they want. And we know that barriers within occupational licensing are one of these important areas that we can address. And some of what Mark had just mentioned, I know there's going to be some overlap in my presentation, but I figure doubling down on some of these things is important, and I'll do my best to answer questions just as Mark did. I think some of what he mentioned is similarly, there's about 1 in 4 workers nationally that require an occupational license in order to work in a particular profession. That number is slightly lower in Georgia, but nonetheless, it's a significant part of the workforce. And I do always like to remind people that 100% of consumers are impacted by this in terms of access to how many people are providers and what the costs are, which can increase when there's not as many providers. And one of the statistics about this is there's over 200 billion annually in misallocated resources across the nation. This is not just sort of the lost revenue opportunities through occupational licensing and reduced jobs, but the fact that people substitute some services for others and make different decisions than they would have if there was more availability. I wanted to kind of talk through the path of occupational licensing, and I know each of you are familiar with this, but it's important to, I think, especially discuss the fact that not only do you pay significant fees and put significant time towards licensing in terms of what the specific government requirements are, but it's not just the fees that are paid towards a licensing board, but we should keep in mind that many times you're paying $15,000 or $20,000 to go to cosmetology school, for instance, or well into 6 figures when we're talking about medical school or very significant professional requirements. And so this is, any place that progress can be made in this can be a big difference to somebody who wants to enter a profession. Georgia, some more recent research, Institute for Justice covers a lot of low and middle income occupations, but there's a broader research that come out this year from the Archbridge Institute. And right here, Georgia is ranked 32nd in licensing burdens, 1 being the worst. So there is some positive for Georgia compared to the nation. But this actually points out that there's 174 different barriers in Georgia for particular professions. And that's the difference between Georgia being noted as having 142 licensing requirements and then 174 is the fact that certain types of professional activities can be covered in a broader occupational license. So maybe if you're doing one particular type of cosmetology practice, let's say hair braiding, in some state, maybe you have to have a cosmetology license instead of a hair braiding license. Well, that would be one of these larger restrictions under the barrier score versus the licensed score. You would still need a license. It's just not even specifically for a profession, but a broader one. But regionally, Georgia actually is a bit better than most of the Southeast in terms of licensing burdens. But one thing I do like to also point out is although licensing is advertised as very important for public health and safety purposes, research does indicate that in many instances, it has neutral or negative impacts. Entrepreneurship rates are lower among low-income residents. And this is understandable because a lot of small business entrepreneurship occurs through professions where occupational licenses are required. A lot of people get into various construction and trades and other other technical jobs. And this is just one place where barriers can make a difference. Recidivism rates are higher amongst ex-offenders. And again, this just something that's well known, and Georgia has been working on reforms in this space, but a lot of times it's difficult to be employed by someone else when you have a criminal record. But if certain restrictions are too high and you're not even eligible to pursue a license, then you often can't even work for yourself due to occupational licensing barriers. And then as a related outcome, there's increased crime rates in areas when there's reduced employment opportunities. And that's something I know that can be of concern nationally, but in many instances in Georgia as well. And this is, I think Mark brought up some of this as well. Consumer costs can be 10 to 15% higher nationally through occupational licensing. There's several million fewer jobs now through occupational licensing. And then I have a little snapshot here of just select occupations. There's 102 select occupations that was studied through Archbridge Institute using Institute for Justice work. But within those licenses, every state just between 1993 and 2012 added 15 to 59 new licenses out of just 102 that were looked at. Georgia was at 23 added. But this is just a way to show how much licensing growth has occurred. Unionization rates in America have dropped similarly to the degree that occupational licensing requirements have increased for professions. And this is one way you can sort of see it just by looking at a small sample of jobs. And that actually has, through research, shown that there's a reduced upward mobility opportunity in states where licensing has increased significantly. This chart here is an inverted pyramid used through Institute for Justice. It may be something that each of you has seen to some degree. It shows that licensing is one of multiple ways that professions are regulated. One of the most open is just to say there's open competition and private litigation. So there's obviously a lot more information available today than there were decades ago due to information on the internet. It's not just word of mouth for someone who's a good doctor to work with or who's a good contractor to bring to my house. But there's a lot of information online now that improves our information. But between that and licensing, there's a lot of other ways that occupations can be regulated. Some of this occurs with licensing. Some of it can occur independent of licensing, such as states providing government certification, where essentially the credentials are protected through a government system, but there is some opportunity to practice outside of having a license, as long as you're not falsely claiming to have certain credentials. Or registration. You can always have bonding and insurance or inspections requirements. A lot of times the greatest way you're determining if construction, electrical work, plumbing work on homes is satisfactory or not is somebody comes by to inspect the work, regardless of what someone's background is. That's a key opportunity. And just the way you'd look at restaurants, for instance, basically the business is licensed at restaurants, but most individuals, including the cooks, where there's a lot of food safety issues, they're not licensed. Instead, inspections are used and other types of regulations to ensure public health and safety. So this is just a reminder of the way we look at it at Americans for Prosperity and a lot in the licensing reform space. And here's another chart just to, again, to sort of discuss what is it that we're asking ourselves when somebody says there's a need for a new license, or questions about whether a license is still valid in a space or ought to be modified. If you know what the nature of the problem is, sometimes you can find out that requiring insurance or some of these other alternatives could be effective. And a lot of times, if there's a government license, sometimes the other oversight mechanisms of government are reduced to some degree because the board is deferred to. And so this is important to understand what the cost and benefits are, and whether the license is where the greatest benefit is, or if there's not an alternative. And I do like to point out the fact that human error can never be fully diminished through a license or any other mechanism. We do know that within highly licensed professions, there are still issues, whether it's contractors that have issues in terms of home building and renovations. There are medical malpractice issues, sometimes illegitimate, but many times legitimate, that people go through. And these are highly licensed individuals. And that's just the fact that through human nature, none of these processes can prevent all public health and safety outcomes, but we're looking for the best combination of addressing legitimate public health and safety concerns without reducing employment opportunities and consumer access. Mark brought this up, and I know it's a big deal with Georgia now having a new law for licensure by endorsement. Over 20 states now have some form of universal recognition, which this is. Virginia and Mississippi, I think, are actually the two closest states sort of within the Southeast region that now have something. Virginia also has a licensure by endorsement version. And then Mississippi has a very aggressive form of universal recognition. One of the things that that has just been raised already is the idea that there ought to be substantially equivalent backgrounds from anyone coming to this state. I think it is worth entertaining the idea of shifting more towards a similar scope of practice. And one thing that some states are doing with universal recognition, Ohio, I can bring up as an example. By having a similar scope of practice approach, it essentially means that you can use a government license, but also private certifications and credentials, and then also military credentials. In essence, the military is almost viewed as another state. It's a place where individuals get certain training and experience. And a lot of times licensing boards will do such an apples to apples comparison. It leaves value on the table. It leaves experience and valid credentials on the table for military. But universal recognition is a great place to address this. And I also like to point out that every military family eventually becomes a civilian one. So to the extent there's any benefit that's been provided for military families or veterans themselves, whether active duty or previous, the stronger the universal recognition law is, it really helps former military and current military at the same time. One of the instances that we've come across, Concerned Veterans for America is one of the groups that under Americans for Prosperity, but there are challenges sometimes. Let's say someone actually is originally from Georgia and been in the military, and they utilize some sort of access for military families in another state. They were stationed at a different base. Well, once they've actually left military duty and they want to come back to Georgia, the military reforms aren't necessarily going to help them because they're no longer active duty. They're no longer officially a military family. So to the extent you can strengthen universal recognition law, you can do it with veterans in mind, just as you can with everyone. And that opportunity, I think, would bring potentially tens of thousands of other individuals to the states. And then there was a question in the previous presentation, because I also want to echo my general support for the idea of not having a residency requirement. I think a lot of times you can also, and I understand that there's probably important tax questions to answer, and I'll leave that as of course for everyone to have an important part of the discussion. A lot of times the individuals who are licensed, they can actually open businesses within other states as well, so that they actually may be a source of additional jobs for those under them. And it may just be the case that they're living on the border, but work full time and are strong contributors to to the economy elsewhere. And then the other question that I recall just from the previous presentation that I could raise now is this idea that maybe there are different requirements from one state to another in terms of what you need to know. You do have the professional skill set, but the question is, do you understand the nuance of a state law? And so, you know, within the typical universal recognition law, you know, one thing you do usually add is something about the jurisprudential exams is what we're basically saying. So if there's a different type of construction code in Georgia and how something needs to be done, that's the goal is to ensure that a state can know that you understand the background and the difference from practicing in one state to the next. I think the idea is to not force people to relearn their skill set, but rather just make sure they understand the different expectations of what you're doing from one state to the next. And so those jurisprudential exams are typically a part of the model bills that states introduce in this, and certainly a practical thing to include. And then before I mention the intermediate licensing reforms here, I'll just say that the one thing I also like to point out, because there's a lot of times there's concern about information asymmetry and the difficulty of evaluating how different states license different professions. Although universal recognition tries to help close those minor differences between exactly what the exams or background looks like, and say that experience and training and credentials for professionals can essentially not have such a strict apples to apples, but we can focus on scope of practice. There's still an opportunity, I think, for Georgia, just as any other state, to look regionally and ask, what does Alabama or Tennessee or Florida do? Are there professions where Georgia is more restrictive than a border state? And I think it's easier probably for the legislature and licensing boards to quickly ask, well, are there different public health and safety outcomes when there's a significantly reduced licensing barrier for one profession in a border state versus Georgia, especially because the universal recognition, or in Georgia's instance, the license by endorsement, may already be accepting individuals from these states to practice, understanding that they have the competency to do so. There's an opportunity, I think, to maybe review and just say, at least regionally, Georgia can meet, if they're not already better than border states, can meet those licensing or professional regulation standards and try to be most competitive. So just to say that universal recognition can draw a lot of people to the state, but maybe also ensuring that border states aren't more inviting for the professions will be another way to do so. And then I'll also mention the criminal justice reform angle. I say it's an intermediate licensing reform simply because the opportunity to reduce barriers in terms of government licensure is the greatest, I think, help of all. When something isn't licensed through government, and training and credentials are great. We're very supportive, and we know that and within each profession, there's a lot of value for consumers, for businesses that hire individuals, for insurance companies, and for everyone to know what your training and credentials are. But when you're talking about the specific government monopoly and sort of government having control of what the license is, that's really the greatest barrier for someone who's an ex-offender. They often don't have the time or necessarily the money to pursue a license, even if they are eligible. So that's somewhat why we call this an intermediate licensing reform. But I do want to speak to the great positives in terms of criminal justice reform. I know Georgia has already made progress in recent years on this. No longer are individuals just automatically sort of barred from pursuing professions by having a criminal record, but instead we're very supportive of the idea of being able to evaluate people on a case-by-case basis and not just outright banning individuals with a criminal background, but allowing a proper review process and making sure that there are valid concerns about somebody practicing a profession, not just excessive caution in ways that is going to essentially, again, create recidivism problems where individuals can't work even though they're willing to and they have a skill set to do so. One of the models is the Collateral Consequences and Occupational Licensing Act, but then SB 157 in Georgia that I know Senator Strickland, who's participating today, was one of the was a chief's primary sponsor of that. I think these are great opportunities for individuals to know before they're pursuing a license. As we said, there's a extreme costs and time burden towards pursuing training and credentials. And so having an understanding of if you're going to have an opportunity to practice really makes a lot of sense. And it was also raised that there's an opportunity to make sure that licenses aren't restricted for other reasons. Student loans in Georgia, and when there's a backlog and payments for somebody, although there may be important for individuals to be held accountable for expenses, you don't want to take away their source of income. And so it's great that Georgia did that. Those are the kind of things that we think in terms of intermediate reforms. And then something else I would also mention, it's worth taking a close look. Does the city of Atlanta or do other localities across the state add additional licensing burdens beyond what the state requires? Sometimes it's just a matter of fees, but there can also be extra burdens. And if you're somebody practicing in the state of Georgia and you go from one county to the next, one town to the next, and have different customers, and you have to have a license in multiple areas rather than having, the belief and the understanding that if I have a license in the state, if I'm approved by the state to perform, if that's not good enough and you have extra burdens, I think that's another place where there will be some reform opportunities, because Georgia has limited in other labor policy spaces, limited what localities can do. That differs from the state, but there may be opportunities within licensing. It's very common across the 50 states to see that, and maybe there's anecdotal opportunities for you to look through that as well. And I will stop sharing the slides and make myself available to answer any questions.
Thank you, Austin. You mentioned on one of your slides that states continue to add licensing requirements, and I think you said Georgia had added, it looks like 43.
I believe 23.
23. It's hard for me to
Although,
read.
go ahead, sorry. Yes, there's and that's only over that was a snapshot from 1993 to 2012, and just over 102 particular occupations. And these are items I could share, but it's from it's a study called License to Work that Institute for Justice does, and then this research was done by Archbridge Institute, taking some of that data. But the growth I know is actually much higher, because there's actually, hundreds more professions that are licensed nationally. And so that's just a snapshot within one portion of licensing. It doesn't include healthcare industry for the most part, and a lot of other occupations. It's really looking at certain technical professions that are more affiliated with low to moderate income. But licensing is across, again, very highly professional occupations that take a lot of schooling and sort of white collar, very high income, and all the way to lower income. So that's just a sense of what's happened in America. I think I noted licensing was, around 1950, about 5% of people, and now it's affects about 25% of people. And as unionization has declined in America, it seems like licensing is sort of, again, not quite the same thing, but it's risen in terms of regulation, where maybe a lot of jobs were more in that path, and now they're much more so under licensing regimes.
If you would share, if you can send me a link to that report or share that with me, I would appreciate it. And related to that, have you all at Americans for Prosperity identified any licensing in Georgia or nationally that we might have, that any recommendations for eliminating particular licensing?
We do work with allies on that research. I don't have readily available a list that I would want to misdirect in terms of exactly what Georgia's licensing right now versus other states, but there is information available. I could provide an analysis that actually would show where Georgia stands compared to all 50 states and then Washington, D.C. So essentially, you could have a comparison for several hundred occupations of where Georgia stands. And I think you could definitely, again, look at that regionally if you want, or nationally. But there will be a number of dozens, I would say, that there would be something significantly different about Georgia versus the states, just because of the nature of how many occupations there are.
That'd be helpful if you'd share that with me too. My last question on your intermediate licensing reforms. I do think if we can get Senate Bill 157 passed, that's gonna address much of this. But the local government licensing, that's not come up yet in our conversations. Are you aware of do you have any Georgia specific information regarding that?
I don't at this moment, but I think it's especially if there's interest in that, very willing to help assist and kind of confirm that. It's typical that there is some of this. We've worked a good bit. Florida is one of the states that actually just did removed the local level of licensure because of how extensive it was in the state. That's just happened over the past year. I believe actually in 2022, the legislative session, just for instance. But I know it's something we've seen out in the Midwest and the Northeast and the Southeast as being very common. And so it's again, a lot of times it varies from whether you actually have to take some other, literally some sort of occupational licensing difference, or if it's a lot of just sort of regulatory red tape in terms of fees and different deadlines you have to keep up with. But it becomes very burdensome, as noted, if you have customers and a lot of and just about every one of these licensed professions, you have an opportunity to have customers from different places. Some of your jobs are in brick and mortar, cosmetology, maybe you work at one place, but so many of the construction trades type jobs, people are traveling everywhere. And so that's definitely something that could have a lot of value if we do find it's very common in the state. I have some degree of confidence it's there, but I would be willing to help explore that further.
We need to drill down on that. I know that when the food truck industry has burgeoned, of course, and is kind of a new thing, the last 5 years or so, we passed legislation, I think in 22, to allow food trucks to get one license in their domiciled county instead of having to get licensed in every county. So that's sort of along that same line of thinking. Chairman Dugan has some questions for you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm the same thing Chairman Walker was talking about back on that more bad news on licensing burden slide. Why 93 to 2012? I mean, 70% of the Senate wasn't even there when at the back end of this thing.
Sure. Yeah, that had something to do with the data availability of the researchers at the time, in terms of having the information they needed. And this was now from several years ago.
Oh yeah,
I believe 2019 might have been when this research was done. But it's extensive work to kind of check all 50 states in terms of what occupations there are. So they utilized existing Institute for Justice research on those 102 professions, and then we're able to look at a time lapse within that regime. And it is explained actually in the research why they utilized based on data availability, some reliability with it. But and it is to say that there's a lot of other occupations not included in that. But it was a good indicator of sort of the national trends, and then some differences across the states.
Yeah. Okay. It just looks a little dated, and I know both you understand that, and Mark, even before, talked about the number of removal of some of these requirements that we've done over the last 5-10 years. So we're down about 12 now, I'm guessing, just add and subtracting there. And the last thing is, Again, just from my understanding, under the universal recognition, who determines if the scope is similar enough?
Yeah, so what I'll note is I mean the licensing boards are determinant of that, but one of the key reasons that this exists is to say that your title is not necessarily a good indicator of what you do in another place. Somebody's definition of a landscape architect or any number of professions could be different, right? A cosmetologist. So even if other states license it, the definition may be different. So it's to say that you could call yourself a physician in another state, but if it didn't mean that you were actually a physician, you wouldn't be licensed based on that title. Instead, licensing board is going to say, okay, here's the services you performed. That's equivalent to this profession in our state, so that you're not essentially practice. Nurses, for instance, a lot of times they have different practice authority from one state to the next. So you could look at essentially their credentials and their backgrounds and ensure that they're given the right the right professional acceptance in Georgia, and not claiming the false thing. But then the challenge of if everything's substantially similar is to say licensing boards, this is sort of the observation across states. But if one state has 10,000 hours of training that comes along before you take an exam, and another state has 8,000, but there's similar content within that could be grounds for denying somebody a license. And a lot of times licensing boards, by default, any regulatory board or agency, I think sometimes they're trying to sort of faithfully execute whatever they're tasked with doing. So I think by default they tend to there tends to be a lot of restrictions, and so if you're sort of transitioning away from that, a lot of times states as well, they're coupling it with the amount of years of experience. So if you have a license from any other state and 1 year of experience, that year of direct experience more than makes up for whether there was 10,000 hours or 8,000 hours of training. Or if you have 3 years of experience and private credentials and experience because they don't license it formally by the government, but you have other credentials, then that serves as a replacement. So that's essentially the idea behind it. But then you're being coupled to the right profession in Georgia, not using a false title to be assigned essentially the wrong qualifications.
Thank you.
Austin, I thought of something else. The Veterans Auto and Education Improvement Act, Mark touched on it in his presentation. How are you seeing that applied nationally, and is it been tested in court much, or are states complying with that? Is Georgia complying with that to your knowledge? And
yeah, I'm not aware quite of how states have interacted with this, but what I it was specifically with the legislation noted. But what I will say is, this dates back really all the way back to the George W. Bush administration, but then through the Obama administration, through the Trump administration, there's been a lot of work through the Department of Defense, Department of Veterans Affairs on doing this. So a lot of states have already, most states have done something in these lines, and I know Georgia as well has done this. So I can't say whether more recently they've been making changes, but a lot of that has been directed, prior. Other than this bill, I know it being a little more directed at veterans. So much of it has been directed towards the spouses and the constant moving around, and this. I don't think that legislation would work as effectively as a state simply sort of again applying as broad of a universal recognition policy to military credentials, because essentially Georgia can be as open as possible to how those credentials are treated, regardless of sort of how other states are doing it. So I don't know exactly how that has been applied yet. Mark may have better knowledge in terms of how that's going. but that is worthwhile to follow up on.
Okay. Thank you, Austin. Senator Anavatari is online, and I guess he'll pipe in if he has any questions. Otherwise, we really appreciate your time today, and I look forward to getting that additional information from you.
All right. Yes, I appreciate the time as well. And thank you.
Thank you. All right. Next on our agenda is Dr. Mancini. He is the president and CEO of Multicultural Development Institute. I will try to pronounce his first name. Luigi.
There you
Luigi.
Now you speak Italian. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Thank you. Good morning, Senator Walker, Senator Dugan, Strickland, and Anivatarte. My name is Luigi Mancini. I'm an administrator and a clinician that's been working in the behavioral health field since 1985. Thank you for inviting me to speak with you today. I really appreciated the way you opened the meeting. My meditation this morning had a phrase that said, bless those who serve those, bless those and the work of those who serve those that want. And this discussion, especially for behavioral health, for mental health, is very timely, not only because in September is Recovery Month, and as you know, we lost over 110,000 Americans to drug overdose in 2022, but it's also Suicide Prevention Month, and we lost 49,000 Americans to suicide in 2022. So the work you're doing and the work of this committee, to me, it comes down to dignity. Not only the dignity of the professionals in the behavioral health field, but the dignity of the individuals that they serve. It is, I believe, our duty to be able to provide everyone in the state of Georgia with the opportunity to access the services needed for them to live the best life that they can live. And right now we're falling short. I have 5 areas that I want to cover with you today. In the introduction, I wanted to give a little bit about the demographics. And you'll hear me talk about US trained clinicians and foreign trained clinicians, because I do see some opportunities, and I'll give you some examples of how it can work. The shortage, when we talk about workforce shortage in behavioral health, my part here is about the licensed clinicians, but the shortage is much bigger than that. We're talking about certified peers. We need more. We need more people in recovery. We need to look at issues of certification versus licensing for addiction professionals. The US Census reports Georgia has 9.7 million US-born individuals and a little over 1.1 million foreign-born individuals. Georgia is one of the most diverse states in the nation. It's top 10 for ethnic and racial diversity, and its population keeps growing increasingly diverse each year, largely because our governor keeps bringing a lot of global business, and those businesses bring people from other countries. Now we need to be prepared in order to serve them as well. In the last 20 years, the state's foreign-born population has grown by almost 90%, compared to just 25% for the state's US-born population. The 2020 census confirmed the trend of a rapidly diversifying population, revealing a surging growth from the Asian community and the Hispanic community. And this includes 1.2 million individuals who identify as Hispanic or Latino, and 64% of them were born right here in Georgia, and 36% were born somewhere else. The Georgia's immigrant diversity is about 50% are from Latin America, and then we have a very growing Asian community, Africa and Europe. And there's also linguistic diversity. The most common non-English language spoken in Georgia is Spanish, followed by Vietnamese, Hindi, Gujarati, German, and Arabic. we need to be prepared to serve individuals that are still learning English and can better communicate in that language. And there's also the stereotype about the professions of immigrants. So there's a lot of diversity, but 11% of the foreign-born population work in management, 16% in service, 10% in sales, 25% in construction and maintenance, and 16% in transportation. But here's the part that I've been working on for about 20 years, and it's that linguistic issue. Half of the foreign-born population in the state of Georgia reports that they speak English less than very well. What that means is that they qualify for what's called limited English proficient. And there needs to be clarification for us to understand, why do we need to provide services to someone and while they're learning English? And I often use the example of a mechanic. Now, my mechanic is from Bosnia. I love my car. He knows everything about my car. And whenever I go see him, he tells me in English everything that's wrong with the car, and it'll cost $700, because everything always costs $700, no matter what it is, right? But if I ask Bali, that's his name, if I ask him to tell me how his emotional state is, he cannot do that in English because he doesn't have that language yet. He knows the English language for his job, but he doesn't know the English language to communicate his feelings and emotions. So that's the part that's important about making sure that we provide services. We had the same issue a few years ago with the deaf community. 500,000 Georgians deaf and hard of hearing, and we didn't have a system for them. Now there is an office, there is a division for deaf and hard of hearing focusing on that issue. So how do we ensure quality care? Nationally, America's behavioral health needs are reaching a crisis point, rising amid gaps of behavioral health workforce. 1 in 5 American adults has a behavioral health condition. Now, there is a difference between a mental health problem and a mental health diagnosis. And we also need to make sure that we understand that, because we need to defeat the stigma associated with behavioral health issues. Before the pandemic, nearly 60% of adults with behavioral health disorders reported not receiving services because of their conditions. Now, after COVID, that was compounded. Now, 1 in 3 adults in the United States report symptoms of an anxiety disorder in 2020, compared to 12 in 2019. What that means is, if you look to the person to your right and you look to your person to your left, and they look fine, it may be you who may have the anxiety disorder. But we have 100 million Americans that live in areas that are mental health shortage areas. There are counties that don't have a single mental health provider in the state of Georgia. You have to cross 1 or more counties to even find one. By 2025, it is estimated that we're going to be short 31,000 clinicians, 31,000 clinicians. So what does this workforce shortages look for? 150 or 159 counties in the state of Georgia qualify for a mental health professional shortage area. 90 counties do not have a psychiatrist. And as I mentioned earlier, there are others that don't have psychologists, licensed professional counselors, licensed social workers. That's 1/3 of the state doesn't have a licensed social worker. In 2019, 25% of Georgia's adults reported unmet behavioral health care needs, and 67% of youth with major depression reported they were not receiving mental health services. The impact of this shortage is really reaching another crisis situation. So in the state of Georgia, 13% adult and children crisis beds offline because of workforce shortages. Now, the National Council of Mental Wellbeing, a very respected national organization, over almost 4,000 behavioral health members, released a report recently. And there are many categories, but I'll highlight 3 of them. One of them is that almost half of the behavioral health workforce has been so overworked that they've considered working as something else, leaving the profession. We cannot afford that. And 93% of the behavioral health workforce has experienced burnout. And that is extremely dangerous because even if they're not addressing their burnout, they're not able to really serve that individual and give them the opportunity to live their best life. There are many more in that report, but because of time, I'll just highlight those three. So what are the issues in Georgia? Well, it's not easy to become a licensed clinician, no matter what state or what university. Now, a few years ago, there was a lot of work into making sure that there were national accreditation of the university programs that need to be met in order for someone to become licensed as a clinician. And when I talk about clinicians, the professional board for this is social workers, licensed professional counselors, and marriage and family therapists. So the requirements, they required everyone to have advanced degrees accredited by certain councils or commissions. It could be the Council for Accreditation of Counseling and Related Educational Programs, or Rehabilitation Education, or Council for Higher Education Accreditation. Same thing for Masters of Social Work, even though they have a national platform, so they're more cohesive when it comes to that. And marriage and family therapists have the accreditation for marriage and family therapy education. So even if they graduate from a U.S. university and in another state and are licensed in another state, and they come to Georgia, they still face barriers in the state of Georgia where they're not able to get this endorsement or this to become licensed in the state in order for them to work here. We actually have a very good friend that works for the state who moved here, and she cannot practice because she can't become licensed here because of these barriers. Now, when we talk about the foreign trained, to date, none of those councils I mentioned earlier certified advanced degrees from outside of the United States. Also, education and licensure under the Georgia board requires a specific amount of time spent in internship and practicum, depending on the position, and supervised practice. There is no pathway for foreign trained clinicians, counselors, marriage and family therapists, or social workers to become licensed in Georgia without having to repeat their master's degree and their supervision requirements. So we have someone that is educated, competent, practicing, and they come here and we're telling them you have to go finish another master's degree so you can become licensed in Georgia. Now, the barriers to recruitment for trained professionals, and you'll see the two boxes, foreign trained and domestically trained. There is no recognition of practical experience, practicum supervision gain in a foreign setting. Now, education verification varies, and this is part of what Senator Dugan's question before is, it's very subjective. How do you assess substantially similar? So that can be a very individual decision of whoever is reviewing that application, and I think that we can do better. I think we can have a more formal process. Education verification varies and offers and often provides equivalency lower than the professional acquired. For example, in other countries, some individuals go to school, university, for 6 years, and then they get their degree and they open their counseling office. When they get those credentials validated here, most of the time they're told is equivalent to a bachelor's degree. So we also, because of that subjective, similar wording, education verification companies evaluate those 6 years and provide a bachelor's degree, sometimes with a few hours towards a master's degree. The other barrier is in other parts of the world, they don't require the internship that we require here. So if you fill out your application and you don't have that box checked, the application gets rejected. And in other countries, the supervision gets recorded differently. So unless you have the supervision like the state wants it, it's going to get rejected. So I think those are part of the areas that we can do something about. Now, domestically, the automatic reciprocity from licensing from another state or even another U.S. territory is difficult. Sometimes the cost associated with having to go back and get another master's degree, and the cost and time to complete that training requirement. So the legislative framework and next steps. So, the title of this was solutions. So I do want to bring you solutions. I don't want to just give you the problem. So I'll give you a personal story. In 1999, I opened Georgia's first multilingual, multinational behavioral health agency. It was a one-person operation. I'm type A personality. They told me there was a need. I just opened it and started seeing people, taking advantage of my ability to speak multiple languages. I couldn't find clinicians to help me, either who spoke English or who spoke other languages. And this is back in 1999. The demand was great. People started showing up. They needed help. Finally, I was able to find a couple of English-speaking therapists to come help me, but I started getting more clients who spoke Spanish or Portuguese, and I couldn't find clinicians that spoke those languages. We took a risk and used the H-1B1 visa process, usually reserved for technology professions, and we were lucky. We were able to get 2 therapists, one from Peru, one from Argentina, to come in and help me with this linguistic access. But they had to go finish a master's degree again. So they had already finished, they were already practicing, but then they had to do that. Then we started meeting with the deans at the universities, identifying different kids. There's a lot of undecided kids. People don't value or they don't look at the counseling profession as a potential profession. So we were successful doing that and ended up creating 42 clinicians and took them all the way to full license. And some of these clinicians were bilingual and some were trilingual. Now, I considered it was still a very small clinic. We were 72 employees and about 5 million in revenue per year. But the solution, the reward, is that we were able to start seeing 150 people each day who were previously suffering in silence. People that did not have the ability to access services that would give them the best life that they could live. And we also did it in a prevention setting. So we had thousands of kids in 5 different cities in the state with primary prevention programs, which I think also needs to be a big part of this. So the other part of the challenge is that Georgia, we're falling behind. There are several states that have already enacted legislation, several states that are already welcoming counselors from other states, from other territories, and from other countries. And they're making the path a little bit easier for them to do that. You see some of these on the screen, Utah, Vermont, and Tennessee, but there's also others. And when it comes to foreign clinicians, Utah actually took the lead, and they're beginning to identify and recognize some of those clinicians, and they're going to end up getting the ones that are, well, they already have. They opened this up for all kinds of licenses, and just in the few months since it passed, they've had over 2,600 applications for people who want to go to Utah because they're going to be able to use their license, or they're going to be given an endorsement. So what do we do for Georgia? As it was mentioned earlier, the slide on the left gives you kind of where we are. You have to have a degree, you have to have supervision, you have to have a practicum. Now, current provision pending in HB 520 to increase recruitment of clinicians from other states, there will be a recommendation to amend that if necessary to include U.S. territories. In particular, we have Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico has one of the highest numbers of very well-educated clinicians, but they don't have a lot of opportunities. So they keep going to school. So from their masters, they get their doctorate. So there's a lot of PhDs actually that can do that. There is, and then creation for foreign trained clinicians. We actually have a template. So about 20 years ago, when I first started my agency and recognized this issue, we came in front of the legislature and we had some solutions, and the solutions were really simple. Verify the credentials and the competency of the individual. Provide them with a 2-year temporary license so they can work under supervision in the United States, seeing clients in their profession, and be able to learn during that time the behavioral health system and the behavioral health language so they could be more efficient. Be under supervision and then go take their exam. And if they pass, they pass. If they don't pass, then they'll have to keep studying. But there are frameworks that we can do. I also began to work with embassies. So I'm helping a client in Maryland who is opening a facility, a large facility. Embassies can have the ability, what we're working is is called a convenio, an agreement, right, between the universities in another country and the universities in the United States. And I think that will expedite this validation of degrees when it's done from university to university. So if the University of Georgia says, yeah, that university in Peru is equivalent, then that degree doesn't have to be questioned here. So I think there's opportunities that we can also take advantage of. And the last couple of slides is, how does this help us? Well, the biggest benefit is improved access to care. Right now, I have had personal friends that call me and said, Pierluigi, I need some help. Can you help me find a counselor? And we're still 2, 3, 4 months of wait for individuals that want to seek some help. And I think we can do better. I think we can help fix that. Improve access, enhance patient outcomes. The longer somebody has to wait to see someone, the more they're going to deteriorate. So we can also help them do that. If we bring more clinicians into the system, we help with those that are burning out. We release some of that burden that they have. Preventive care, innovation, and improve community well-being. Another benefit, economic benefit, is job creation. I mean, if we bring more clinicians into the States, this will be tax-paying individuals that will also be helping not only the state, but revenue generation for the agencies they're going to be working for. At the end of the day, we want to make sure that we reduce healthcare costs. We want to reduce the number of people dying from an overdose. We want to reduce the number of people dying by suicide. And we want individuals to live the best life that they can live. Thank you very much.
Chairman Dugan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Statement and a question. So with your presentation, if we have time travel, we bring Sigmund Freud forward. He couldn't practice in Georgia.
Correct. Unless he was licensed here, unless he went to a Georgia university, got a master's degree from a university in Georgia. Now, there are exceptions. I mean, there are people that move from other states and they're able to successfully navigate the process. But most of the times, the ones that I've seen, they have to go back to school at some point.
Okay. Now, here's my question. I'm looking at your mental health professional shortage area.
Yes.
My home county is Carroll County.
Ah.
We have a facility called Willowbrook within the county.
Correct.
Yeah, I talked with them a pretty good bit. If I had the required number of psychiatrists, psychologists, mental health counselors that we needed to fill every shortage they're not going to the rural areas. They're staying in the urban areas. I can't force them to move. So help me with that.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. And, you know, I also think that's part of an easy fix. Now, we do provide, whenever we make an allotment, whenever we help someone either with their student debt or some process for them to practice here, there are many professions that say, well, for 2 or 3 years, you have to work in one of the shortage areas. Now, the reality is that there are people that are coming to Georgia that want to be in smaller cities. I have a wonderful psychiatrist friend of mine, and she loved Peachtree City because it was, you know, further from the big cities. So I think there are people that can do that. But I also think that we can put a requirement. Okay, you know, we're going to help you become a practicing licensed clinician here, but you have to go work in rural areas for a while.
Okay. I would not compare Peachtree City to Osceola, but I take your point. And that's I mean, we do that with other areas too. So I can see where that would be in there. One of the things I have that my friends in Willowbrook talk to me about is the reason they stay in the more urban areas is because they have a support group of other people within their profession that they can bounce stuff off of. And, you know, for years and years, mental health providers were amongst the leaders in self-harm themselves.
Right.
And by having that group, so any ways ahead on if we put them in rural areas that you could have I hate to use virtual support group, but that's the best thing I can think of right now.
No, I think that's extremely important. I mean, the best therapist has a therapist. You know, I go to therapy, it's in and out. I mean, I see my primary care physician 1 time a year for my physical. Thank God for that, right? But the same thing with counseling. I go to a counselor when I have an issue I need to work through. And when I work through it, I stop. I don't have to go for the rest of my life, right? So the same thing with needing to support each other, right? So the best therapist has a therapist, but we also need that fraternity. Virtual meetings are great, but I will challenge the providers to provide the environment for those clinicians to thrive. My clinicians were with me 13, 14, 15 years, and that's unheard of in this profession. There's a 3 to 4 year turnover rate everywhere you look.
Mhm.
Why? Because we provided that. We provided a place for them to talk, a place for them to talk to each other and to discuss things, but also we would do other activities that were better than an increase in pay, which is usually where people want to go. And clinicians actually appreciated those other activities more than that.
But most of the people in the room and meeting you for the first time know that my master's in psychology. And the only reason I got that was they put me next to Senator Walker on every meeting, just so I can keep my eye on.
You're secretly,
Yeah. I have to every once in a while like
That's
that.
there you go.
great.
Thank you. Appreciate your
My
presentation.
pleasure. Thank you so much, Senator.
Senator knows of which he speaks. Thank you, Doctor. So first of all, I think, is Daniel still here? So Daniel Dorsey's here with the Composite Medical Board. I want to recognize him, thank him for coming. They are working with us to try to address some of these healthcare workforce shortage needs we have. And so I just want to make sure that everybody knows he's in the audience. He's available to answer any questions. And I think he's committed, I'm committed to making progress on our healthcare workforce needs. I live in Houston County.
Mhm.
We're about 165,000 people. I think we might have 2 psychiatrists in the whole county. I mean, it's very much a need. If we can go to the barriers to recruitment for trained professionals page, maybe. No, hang on a second.
Slide 16.
Let's see. I think I want to go to the solutions page. Sorry, slide 20.
Yes.
On the left-hand side, the current law, the accreditation issue, and I work with various industries in my legislative role and then in my professional role. And accreditation is always an issue of topic of discussion. It's of course a revenue source for the accrediting agency, and it's some do better than others. But anyway, my question is there a additional accreditation that would be more common in Hispanic speaking countries or more common in European or foreign countries that is not internationally recognized that we could simply add to and say this, if they have either this accreditation or that accreditation, we're going to recognize that as their education is going to be they're going to get credit for that.
To my knowledge, there is not. There is not a global accreditation for universities with clinical programs, but I will do my research and I'll find out and let you know if I find something.
Okay. And then on the right-hand side, House Bill 520. So that I guess has been introduced and maybe it's still alive and it just didn't get passed, but it would recognize other U.S. territories for the education component of the licensing requirement.
It's other states. We're recommending that maybe we also look at territories so they don't get left out. There are territories that may have universities that are accredited. So I wanted to clarify that. But my understanding is that House Bill 520 does have part of it that shows how we'll make it easier for clinicians from other states to come to Georgia and be able to practice here.
Okay. Just as a side note, in Houston County and especially in Perry, seems like we've had a number of medical doctors from the Philippines, and they have all done very, very well and are really trusted and vital members of our community and our healthcare community. What is it? Is there anything particular about the Philippines, or are they just kind of like they know somebody and they're in Perry, so they come to Perry? I mean, is the Philippines treated different, or?
I don't think it's necessarily the Philippines. I know that the next speaker is going to talk about the medical profession, but I know that one thing is the English language is a benefit. So they come in, they're already fluent in English. And when immigrants come into the state, we usually go to where other immigrants from our same countries are. So you have large pockets of individuals, they feel comfortable and they migrate towards where others are.
Okay. Just bear with me a second. I'll try to get I had another. Oh, so go over again, the counselors, social workers, marriage and family therapy. What all are you addressing? What all different licensing? So you talked about psychiatrists, which are medical doctors,
Right.
too.
But I'm not addressing them here. I think
Okay.
Darlene's going to talk to you about that. For me, what I was addressing was those three that are under the same professional board. So the professional board for licensed professional counselors, social workers, and marriage and family therapists. When you have, one of the issues is in some other states, what we call a licensed professional counselor, they may call a licensed mental health counselor, right? So there may be some differences there that already are creating some barriers. And I think that what I'm trying to address is the current licensing process in Georgia has some very strict rules that I think we need to soften up, because they are eliminating individuals who are qualified and ready to serve because they don't meet the exact definition of those rules. It could be the number of hours. I think that example was used earlier. So if in another state, I only had to do 300, but here you require 600, and I've been practicing 20 years, are you going to make me go and be under supervision for 300 more hours so I can meet that? So I think that that's the kind of the part that I'm addressing is for the licensed clinicians.
So my counselor to my left here, and we are also on the Georgia Works Commission for the Secretary of State. And at our meeting in Athens, we had the licensed counselor people spoke, and I think they've got to have like 3,000 hours of experience after going to school for 6 years. I mean, it was unbelievable
Yes.
to me. It seemed like a lot,
It's not easy. I
but
mean,
I guess, it seems to me, and this is not specific to your industry or these licenses here, but oftentimes it's the industry itself that is asking for or putting these requirements. It's not the state, it's not in the code. It's the industry, and it's somewhat, I guess, protectionism for their competition, it seems. And I'm not saying that's the case here, but I mean, that they could change that. They could lower the hours if the board, am I right? I mean, if the board decided, 1,500 hours is enough. A lot of this stuff, we could mandate it legislatively, but you would hope the boards would move in that direction.
Mr. Chair, if I may, I think part of what they do look at is the education piece, right? What are the modalities that your school taught? What are the different types of practice that your school taught? So there's a list of maybe 10, 15 different areas that are in the code, that are in the law. And the hours were just increased recently. So that's also in the code, how many hours and supervision they need to have, and the practicum and the internships. So those are pretty, and I think, again, I go back to that subjective language of what is substantially similar. And I think that's the part that we can do something about.
Okay.
Yeah, I still haven't heard an answer that I'm comfortable with on that yet. Your vision of substantially similar and mine are not going to be the same. I'm gonna keep asking that until somebody gives me a really, really good answer. I go, that's it.
Or we can change it.
But something substantially similar.
Thank you very much.
Daniel, not to put you on the spot, but related to this subject, is there anything you'd like to comment on, or anything we've said that seems wrong? Or
No, the gentleman was speaking more about marriage and family therapists in that profession. I know the next speaker is going to talk about medical licensure, so she may hit on some of those points that my comments were relevant.
okay, thank you. Thank you, doctor. Appreciate it.
Thank you all. I did.
Yeah, Darlene, come, you get ready and we'll, Senator Dugan's taking just a quick break. All right, Darlene, thank you for being here. Darlene Lynch is the head of external relations for the Center for Victims of Torture. But she's going to talk to us today on expanding the healthcare workforce and reforming medical licensing in Georgia.
That's right.
Yes, ma'am. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you to the whole committee. I am Darlene Lynch, and I do work for the Center for Victims of Torture, which is a nonprofit in the state of Georgia that helps refugees and others heal from war and from torture and live full lives in our state. But I'm here also on behalf of the big partnership, which is Business and Immigration for Georgia, BIG, founded in 2020 by business organizations and refugee and immigrant organizations that really wanted to come together to strengthen Georgia's economy by tapping into all the potential we have in our refugee and immigrant communities. So it's a pleasure for me to be here. I presented on a similar topic a few years ago to the House Study Committee on maximizing global talent, and some of this will harken back to that. So I have, let's see, oh good. 4 areas I want to touch on. Georgia's physician shortage. I think that's pretty well known, so I won't spend too much time there. The opportunity to address this problem lies in our deep pool of global talent. These are folks that are already living in Georgia. The challenge are barriers to practice and a real accelerating competition for medical talent across the nation. And the solution that I'd like to offer are some licensing reform ideas and other innovative approaches that states have taken. So the health professional shortage, obviously, it's not just in Georgia. The United States is projected to have a shortage of up to 124,000 physicians by 2033, and many nurses as well, hundreds of thousands of nurses as well. And so there is a race, not just in Georgia, but across the country to figure out how we are going to address these shortages. In Georgia, most of Georgia is medically underserved. We mentioned earlier, Pierluigi, and I think others, that only 90 out of 159 counties have no psychiatrist right now. So this is a medical licensing issue. It's regulated, by the composite board, but it impacts mental health, obviously, because we have no psychiatrists and we have no one who can administer the medicines that are needed to treat mental health. But we also have a shortage of OBGYNs, a shortage of pediatricians, and then a shortage of doctors completely in 9 of the states. So 1 out of 3 Georgians live in areas without a primary care physician. And we would need nearly 700 new doctors to meet demand. And we know that Georgia's been tracking this. We have the Georgia Board of Healthcare Workforce that was created specifically to try to get on top of this situation. So this report came out from the Governor's Commission on the state of Georgia's healthcare workforce. And it was determined, this just came out in 2022, that Georgia is going to have to fill 240,000 positions, 66,000 new positions, and 173 people that would have to be replaced. We have an increase in demand at the same time because we are seeing a lot of population growth. And as Dr. Mancini pointed out, a lot of that growth is in our immigrant communities. Our population is aging generally across the board. And with that comes a greater level of disease. And what is a bit scary, 20% of our healthcare workers, or certain healthcare workers, are about to retire. So the Governor's Commission had recommendations in 3 categories: maximizing the existing workforce, optimizing healthcare education, and the last one, which this presentation will focus on, is attracting new workers. Shane Jackson, who I think is well known to this committee and to others, is the CEO of Jackson Healthcare, which is a leading national healthcare staffing company. He presented to Chairman Alber's study committee last week or the week before, I think, and basically said, we cannot train our way out of this physician shortage. We do not have enough Georgia students. We do not have enough Georgia medical school spots. We need to compete nationwide to attract people to our state. And I would add internationally to have more people come into our workforce. So the opportunity, when we talk about licensing reform, and the first 2 individuals who shared information today speak about licensing reform, there are always 4 categories. And one is people who are moving state to state. Another is military and spouses. Another is people with a criminal record. And the third that states have been studying for decades are immigrants, skilled immigrants, and of different backgrounds and different areas of practice. So Georgia is very lucky. As Dr. Mancini pointed out, we have a very deep pool of global talent. Our state is very attractive to people from other countries as a place where they can start again and find good work and contribute. Some of the misconceptions, though, about this talent that we have in Georgia are addressed by this slide. So first of all, 10% of Georgians, more than 1 million people, are foreign born, and they're bringing skills and talents from countries all around the world. Nearly half are already naturalized U.S. citizens, and the others are on a path to citizenship. 75% have at least a high school education, and 33% have a college degree or greater. And they have language and cultural skills that a lot of Georgians lack. In the city of Clarkston, where I work, there are 60 languages, and it's often called the most diverse square mile in all of America, not just in Georgia. One of the reasons we're so diverse is because we have a refugee program. And I know, Senator Dugan, you and I have spoken about this. Unlike other states, Georgia has been welcoming to refugees. So people who have had their lives upended by war, by conflict, and they are coming from all different backgrounds. They're doctors, they're dentists, they're IT professionals, they're agriculture workers. All of a sudden, one day, their country is in turmoil. And Georgia, for more than 40 years, has opened its arms to these folks and given them a chance in our state to start again. So every year, Georgia is welcoming about 3,000 new people with talents and experience from other countries around the world. This is a pool of talent that other states in our surrounding area do not have to draw upon. Some of these folks who are coming are doctors. Many of them have already speak English. So we saw recently that Georgia welcomed almost 2,000 people from Afghanistan. These were our allies in Afghanistan who were evacuated by the United States, their family members, and others who were part of the U.S. mission in Afghanistan, as well as we are now welcoming hundreds, thousands from Ukraine who have had their lives disrupted by the Russian invasion there. There are doctors and other healthcare workers and other skilled folks in this mix. So how do we get them into the workforce, right? Too often, my organizations at the big partnership are watching doctors driving Ubers. We're watching dentists working behind a CVS counter, a welder who's going to work in a poultry plant. They're not going back into the fields where they have the most experience. So today we're going to talk about physicians in particular. I want to take a little step back because Georgia already relies very heavily on foreign trained physicians, as the chairman referred to. Today, nearly 1 in 5 doctors, I think it's 17 or 18% in Georgia, is foreign born. So these particular doctors took a very hard road to to practice in Georgia. In Lawrence County, 25% of doctors are of Indian descent. A couple of years ago in 2018, there was a series of articles in local news that looked at foreign trained doctors in rural communities. There's one doctor who's pictured here. He's from a Southwest Georgia town of Richland, and he's the only doctor in Stewart County and Webster, practiced for 37 years. This is from 2018, and there's maybe a possibility that he's retired now. As Brad Lofton, who is the president of the Economic Development Authority in that part, in the Lawrence part of Georgia, states, we're grateful to our international doctors. Not only do they bring high quality medical care, but they've become important to economic development. People don't want to move where there are no doctors. We know with the hospitals closing that's very much a reality in a lot of parts of our state. So not only are foreign born doctors working in these rural areas, but they're also helping serve the poor and the uninsured. They're providing healthcare at our FQHCs and free clinics, and they're working with farm workers in the agricultural industry. And they're doing that partly because they want to give back, partly because they have the cultural and linguistic skills that are needed to do that work. So this is not new to Georgia, that we have, foreign-born doctors serving our communities. But for every doctor that has navigated the system, there are many more doctors that have not been able to. So another doctor, that was a focus of the 2018 series, it took him 8 years to re-enter practice. He was an orthopedic surgeon in Iran. He took 16 years to become, he had 16 years practice in Iran. He passed all of his exams, US medical exams, but he couldn't get into a residency. So he applied over and over and over every year, spent tens of thousands of dollars, and finally was able to practice in the United States. And it took 7 years to do that. In this picture is my colleague. His name is Dr. Dawood Azimi. He was trained in Kabul, Afghanistan. He is a ICU physician. He was 13 years in training and in school to be an ICU physician. And he worked at the French Medical Institute for Mothers and Children in Kabul, where he treated Americans and Afghans. He now works for my organization as a mental health program coordinator. And he's happy for that work. He's happy to be able to support other Afghans in the mental health needs, but he would like to be a doctor. He's here. He came here actually because he's a Fulbright scholar. While he was here, his country fell apart and he couldn't go back. So, what are the barriers? The barriers are that international experience or credentials are not fully recognized. The processes are very costly, as I just described, very time consuming. Some of our foreign trained doctors do need English learning options. Dr. Azimi does not. So the way this works right now, and I hope that Daniel will correct me if I get this wrong, IMGs is what they're called, International Medical Graduates. They have to show proof of a medical degree from an approved medical school. And there are a variety of schools that have been approved. We look to California actually to see which schools are on that list. The Kabul school is on that list, so that's good. Some people are going to come from a school that's not on that list. They have to take all their medical exams, and then they have to do a residency. If you came from an approved medical school, your residency will be shorter. If you came from a non-approved medical school, your residency will be longer. Either way, you have to pass all the US medical exams in English. There are only a few post-grad programs in the whole world outside of the US and Canada that are approved. So what that means is for most people, they got to start again. Very similar to what Dr. Mancini was talking about. So for most doctors, whether they were orthopedic surgeons for 16 years or an ICU doctor for 13 years, they're going to have to at least do another US residency. And the problem is we don't have enough US residencies, not in Georgia and not nationwide. So right now, in the last year, I know you're probably familiar with the matching, you have to match, right? So my son-in-law is actually just matched and was very grateful to have matched at a medical school in Texas. But there are 3,000 fewer spots than there are applicants. And it depends a little bit on what you're going into. The international grads have much lower rates of matching. So 90% versus like 60%. So many of them, as I said, have already done postgraduate training, have already practiced for long periods of time, and sometimes under very challenging circumstances. So if we were to create alternatives to this residency in the United States, we'd be opening up spots for other applicants, other students, and we'd be addressing our workforce shortages much more quickly. So how have other states been doing this? This has taken off like wildfire, and you probably have heard about this. I know I've talked to Chairman Walker about this. But there have been states since 2014. Missouri was actually the very first state to have what's called an associate physician program. That's different than a PA. It's an AP, but associate physician program, which means if you passed your medical exams and you've finished your medical, you have your diploma, you practice under supervision for a certain period of time with a provisional license or a temporary license. And if you succeed under supervision, you can go get your full license. So very similar to what Dr. Mancini was suggesting for mental health clinicians. So Missouri had that program in 2014, then Arkansas, then Arizona, and for a whole bunch. This year, and in 2022, it has taken off. Colorado created a streamlined pathway. Utah, as Dr. Mancini mentioned, created a streamlined pathway. All these states, Florida, Texas, Virginia, Arizona, have bipartisan bills that moved but didn't pass to further integrate foreign trained physicians. Idaho just passed something to help refugees, asylees, and humanitarian parolees, like folks from Afghanistan, to practice in underserved areas. So that's something that can be done. You can require that someone spend some time in an underserved area. Tennessee is the one that has a lot of folks worried in Georgia. And I'm going to focus a little on that. Illinois did something interesting. They basically, the legislature passed legislation that said we will create a streamlined pathway for international medical graduates, but we will let the licensing department figure out exactly how to do that. And then Alabama has just reduced the number of years to make it a little less burdensome to go through the normal system. So as I mentioned, Missouri was the first one to do this, and it passed in 2014. It took them 3 years to really launch the program, but then their workforce increased by 3% in 5 years. And they don't have the pool of talent that Georgia has. And they are not as attractive as a state for immigrants as Georgia is by a long shot. Tennessee has an employee sponsorship model. So what that means is that if you have a foreign medical graduate who meets threshold requirements, he passes the U.S. medical exam, no problems in their history and so forth, they can receive an offer of employment from a hospital or a hospital system, work under supervision for that hospital for 2 years, and then get a license. A couple states do things differently. Washington doesn't limit the employers to just hospitals and hospital systems, but will also allow an FQHC, a federally qualified health center, and public health clinics and private practices to offer employment as well. And this helps address some of the needs in underserved, refugee and immigrant communities in particular. And then Massachusetts just passed something very similar, but it's sort of a 1 year. If you do okay for the first year of supervision, you can renew it for another year. And they actually do require that you serve in an underserved part of the state. So I showed you my colleague, Dawood Azimi, and I think I've mentioned this to the chairman, but it is usually about every few weeks, he asks me more about Tennessee. And I don't know how much longer we're going to keep him at our office. So there are other workforce initiatives that are going on around the country to attract and retain foreign talent. Many states have what they call an IMG assistance program or a welcome back center. And these are just places that are there to show that these folks are welcome and to help them navigate these systems. Some states like Illinois and Colorado have subsidized readiness programs with some English learning options, and that's in collaboration with their medical schools. Some have dedicated people at the licensing board. Others have used loans and subsidies to pay for re-entry expenses. And then many have started this process with a private-public commission. And, you know, some of them have just started recently and others have done this ages ago. So, you know, what is Georgia doing? I explained what the process is, very bare bones. There's other complications to it that I didn't get into. As far as I know, that process has not changed in recent years as it relates to IMGs. The Medical Association of Georgia has a very simple standard that says it opposes the lowering of IMG licensing standards. And it has reaffirmed that over and over and over again. There have been reform efforts to change that, and they have not been successful in the past. So while other states have been moving forward, at least with a partnership, a task force to look at this, to have done a variety of things, Georgia really hasn't. We have made much more progress actually on mental health reform, which usually is the second thing states do, than on medical reform. And I will say that House Bill 520 did include a provision on international, creating a pathway for foreign trained mental health clinicians as well as out-of-state clinicians. And that had the full endorsement of the Governor's Behavioral Health Reform Commission. So we are doing great on the mental health side. We still have a ways to go on the medical side. The solution, you know, my recommendation, and after talking to many national groups, after talking to some of our clinicians that I work with and others, is to establish, or at least start to look at, an assistant physician program like Tennessee. If barring that, establish ASAP a private public task force, the Hospital Association, the Rural Health Association, the Refugee and Immigrant community, bring those folks together to really start figuring out how do we maximize this talent that we have. Additional steps: reduce the residency requirement for IMGs so it's equivalent to US grads. Right now, IMGs have to work a year more than a US grad, train a year more. That's what Alabama fixed. Establish some of those navigation helpful assistance programs that we mentioned, that I mentioned in a previous slide. So I think that to me would be the way forward, and I am happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Darlene. When on this associate physician pathway, and the hospital can hire them, and then in Massachusetts, I think, or somewhere else, that was Tennessee, and then somewhere else they allowed FHQCs and public health.
Right.
So they hire them, and they're doing what a doctor would normally do. I mean, there's no restrictions on their scope of practice or.
Correct, but they are under supervision. So and maybe this is a good question for the expert in the back. I'm not sure exactly what that means. You know, what degree of supervision that is. I think it probably depends on the state and the board to decide what that means exactly. But they do not have a full license. They have a provisional license, temporary license, limited license, called different things. And they really are being supervised and assessed by the hospital. In Washington State, it's broader, where they're being supervised and assessed by FQHCs and so forth.
So do you have any information or idea of what their compensation is compared to a fully licensed?
You know what? I
physician?
don't know, but I can find out.
I mean, it would be less, I would think. And then the other question that comes to mind is there any problem or challenge with them getting insurance or Medicare or to pay for their services?
No, and I think that was, you know, when I was talking with some of the national folks, that was one of the reasons for an employee sponsorship program, because they would come under the insurance, I guess, of their employer. So that's why this has become a more popular approach recently. So I don't think that that's an issue. I think this new approach addresses that, but I can confirm.
Well, the point, I guess, I understand coming under their insurance as far as professional liability for the organization, but I mean, if I see a associate physician, are they going to charge Anthem or United Healthcare or Medicare? Are they able to charge at the same rate as a fully licensed physician
I'll find out.
under the codes they charge under? Okay, thank you for that. That's very good.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I got a series of questions here. On your map with the underserved.
Yeah.
Define that term, please.
So medically underserved is just folks who have, they're limited services for that particular area across the board. So I don't have the actual definition of what that is, but I can find it for you. But it's the other maps that the Board for Healthcare Workforce puts out are related to specific specialties. So there's one for primary care and there's one for psychiatrists. This is a definition that's a federal definition. I don't know exactly what it is. That is generally medically underserved. I don't know if my friend in the back knows the answer to that.
I get accused of being a homer sometimes. But the third largest employer in Carroll County is the hospital system.
That's good.
But it's pink on here.
Well, yeah, and I don't know what the answer is to that. You know, I can find out, but I think, you know, the main point is, and, you know, if we could look at all the maps for the different specialties, they're going to look very similar. You're going to see the gray is the good part. You're going to see very few gray. So it may not be Carrollton County, but it's going to be bad somewhere else.
Yeah. Where I'm going with this thing and is we get put a lot of information in front of us.
Yeah.
I want to make sure that we're looking at the most accurate information possible. So that's why I'm asking this. On the next one, the on your barriers to practice for international medical graduates.
Yep.
The question I'm going to get asked on this is how are we balancing filling a need with patient safety?
Yep.
What do I tell them?
Well, I think that, you know, there are a number of ways. First of all, these folks are already, unlike the earlier two folks who testified, there are exams. They're not getting brought in with no exam. They have to pass the U.S. medical licensing exam and all the other board exams that are required from any other doctor. So they are passing those, they're passing them in English. They have to have graduated from a medical school that is either on the approved list or is acknowledged as a medical school. So they have to go through that process. If it's on the approved list, they have a post-grad training that's shorter. If it's not on the approved list, they have a post-grad training that's longer. So I think that, you know, we're going to still have a post-grad process, but it's supervision instead of a residency. So one of the good things about that is that you're going to have other Georgia med students getting residencies, and you're going to have this other pathway for experienced doctors to work under supervision. And so there is still this, you're not letting anybody just get a full license. They're coming in provisionally and they're being assessed. And if you want to do what Massachusetts does, you give them 1 year and then you renew it. So, you know, there are safeguards to that. It's not an automatic process by any means, but hopefully it's not 7-8 years either.
Okay. The associate physician program, understand that we don't currently have that, but it almost looks like you're just wanting to expand the state's waiver program.
It could be done that way. I mean, I think that there are a lot of different ways to have it done. You know, like I said, Illinois basically said to I guess they have a department of licensure that does cover medical, whereas ours does not. But they basically said, you guys figure out how to do this, right? It has to be a streamlined pathway. If you want to call it a waiver or you want to call it an associate physician, you can call it what you want to call it. And I'll be honest with you that because we're at such an early stage on medical licensing reform, I haven't explored all those ins and outs yet. I hope we could. But it's very complex. So another thing that's added complexity is, what if you're a refugee and you've been in a camp and you haven't practiced for a number of years, right? So what if you haven't updated your license? You can't go back to your country. So what do other states do? So it depends. If you were a cardiologist for 30 years, you might have a longer look back period. So, maybe if you didn't have the license renewed for 3 years, if you were a brand new doctor, maybe you don't have a long, you don't have a long look back period. So it is complex. But other states have been working on this for a really long time.
I was with you in everything until you said the camps. You lost me on that one. Because there are not, in the areas that you said where we have refugees coming in, there aren't camps like that. If they are, they have Doctors Without Borders that are working there with them, and they would be working alongside. I would assume they would take any help they could get. The only other thing that I have, and I found it a little bit ironic, is the private public commission, those states that are allowing the new licensure pathway, 7 out of the 10 that are listed there are the least diverse states in the country.
I know. I think that attests to the workforce shortages. We have an advantage that we are so diverse, and we have refugees coming in every single year, and we have immigrants coming in people want to be in Georgia. So if we were to do what some of these other states are doing, I think we'd see a lot more dividends than they are. Yeah, I think like we said, Missouri saw a 3% increase in 5 years. We should see better than that, I would think. Utah just had 2,400 people, all different kinds of skilled trades applying to Utah. And I'll tell you that folks who have trained their whole life and have committed to being a physician to help people, they will move where they can practice. We are going to lose my friend at my organization because it's their life. And so if they got to go to Utah, they're going to go to Utah, but if they can go to Tennessee, that's a lot better.
As long as they're residents.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good presentation.
Thank you.
Daniel, any comment, rebuttal? Y'all working on this?
Yeah.
Yeah, just I'm gonna provide some additional commentary, and just kind of how.
Daniel, do you mind to come to the mic? And then we're going to take a brief break.
Daniel Dorsey, Georgia Composite Medical Board Executive Director. Just want to provide some perspective on how the medical board's current regulatory framework regarding medical licensure is today. So the medical board verifies education and training credentials of all applicants prior to issuing a license. This may include the following items, such as a transcript from a medical school indicating MD, DO, MBBS, those are the degrees, or an equivalent degree. The second would be a certified translation of the medical school transcript. Sometimes it's issued in a different language, and so it has to be translated correctly. The copy of the certification of Education for Commission on Foreign Medical Graduates. That is an organization that provides a certification for individuals that are coming from a school outside of Canada and the US. Forms that verify the appropriate amount of years of postgraduate medical education. And I'll get into that and below, and Darlene had touched on it briefly. And then the last is a verification of licensing examination scores. It's been the Georgia Composite Medical Board's policy since 2010 to use a list of approved medical schools located outside the US and Canada. She referred to it, it's the California list, so that's how it's commonly called. The Medical Board of California has developed a list that is seen as kind of an industry benchmark that other medical boards across the country have adopted as far as what schools that meet the similar accreditation that the schools in the US have. And graduates on the approved list are only required to complete 1 year of physician resident training. That's the graduate medical education training after medical school. And so the California list, we also use the National Committee on Foreign Medical Education and Accreditation. That organization is charged with determining whether standards of accreditation used by a foreign country to accredit their medical schools is comparable to the accreditation that U.S. takes. And it just kind of looks at, is it comparable? And so we use both the California list and the NCFMEA for graduates of a non-approved. So if their school is not on one of those approved lists, that individual will need 3 years of residency training. And so they can still come here. They just need that additional training, that additional supervision and training that comes through a residency program. The current specialty certification, so if someone's board certified in family medicine or internal medicine, we actually will waive the residency training requirement if they have that specialty certification. It's seen as comparable level of training to get that certification as it would be to go through residency. The board does offer an institutional license, which is geared towards applicants who've completed medical education or training in other countries. The board issues those licenses under exceptional circumstances to graduates of international medical schools who an institution wishes to employ, but that person does not have the independent license to practice medicine in the state of Georgia. This institutional license is jointly awarded to the applicant as well as the institution. And for the purposes of this license, an institution would be a hospital license under the Department of Community Health, a board-approved medical school, or a teaching hospital within the state, or a clinic within the state that services Medicaid, indigent, or underserved populations. The institutional license has been a successful vehicle for internationally trained physicians who cannot get a regular medical license to practice in Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I'm going to be here, I'm going to ask questions. You were going really quick there. I would like to have
A copy.
yes, please.
Yes, sir.
You said FECHMA or something like that. There was like 9 letters that you said that does an evaluation of.
NCFMEA, the National Committee on Foreign Medical Education and Accreditation.
I felt like I just filled my eye chart. How do you know? I mean, you're looking at the transcripts and you're putting an American view on a transcript title. We have people that actually go to those medical schools and observe?
So for medical schools that are in the US and Canada, they're licensed or they're accredited through, I forgot the acronym, but it's an acronym, and it's in a pretty stringent qualifications in order to achieve that accreditation. For international programs, there's all these other entities, such as the National Committee on Foreign Medical Education and Accreditation is taking a look at those programs and determining, how comparable is it to the standards that are applied in the U.S. The education.
Before you leave that's my question. How are they doing that evaluation?
So they're taking a look at how many hours that students going through those schools are, how many hours of education they have as it relates to clinical, just the theory behind. There's a complicated algorithm, I guess, or chart that they use to determine, they're getting this amount of hours, in this area and that area, and that's similar to the same level of training that they're receiving at medical schools in the U.S.
Significantly similar. Okay. And we talked about a shortage of resident slots here in the slide. You agree that that's an accurate number?
I don't remember what the number was, but in I want to say we have resident, so we're also the issuing entity for residency training permits in the state. Currently, we have, as of September 5th, we have 3,054 residency training permits in the state. As far as where that's been in the past, and we have seen an increase in GME, the graduate medical education, over the past several years as new slots have rolled online. But
So is that state or nation? Okay. So let's bring it back to Georgia here. You were talking about the 3-year residency for the ones that were not from a there was a definition that you gave for it. Is that realistic that they're going to get a 3-year residency slot if we have a shortage of residency slots for U.S. trained doctors now?
It's possible that they could get into a residency training program. I know these programs look at a lot of different things when determining if an individual is gonna get extended a slot or not at their respective program. But I don't think that there are enough residency slots for the amount of graduates that are coming out.
I think she
Yeah.
stated that if they're US trained, it was a 90% placement rate
Bless you.
for residency. And if it foreign trained, it was 60%.
I'm not sure about those percentages.
One sounds like we need more residency programs. All right. Thank you. Appreciate it. I do want a copy of that because
I'll make sure.
you talk the fastest I've ever heard with a Southern accent.
Yes, sir.
All right. Thank you. We're going to take a brief break. Emily Yona is provided lunch and I was going to let her go first, but she left. And the way this works, we don't have enough lunch for everybody here. So the staff, Senate staff goes first, and then the legislators are going to go next. And then if there is food left over, it's going to be first come, first serve, I guess. But we do want to take let's take a 20-minute break. We'll just say, let's just reconvene at 1 o'clock. And then we have 2 more presenters. So the last 2 presenters, I'm going to put them on the lunch list after the legislators because they have to stay. There is a cafeteria in this building, essentially, or connected to this building. That's really good. It'll be better than what we're going to have. So for those that don't get a Chick-fil-A sandwich, there is a good cafeteria right here on campus. So thank you, Mackenzie, for setting that up, and let's do it. We'll be back promptly at 1 o'clock. 5 minutes late, I guess, or 10. Let's reconvene the meeting, and next I'm gonna introduce Polly McKinney with Advocacy Director for Voices for Children. And then let her introduce our speakers.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Polly McKinney, I can't even say my name today. Advocacy Director of Voices for Georgia's Children. And we're presenting along with Sarah Familia on licensing barriers for foreign trained behavioral health workers. And we know that there's already been a presentation on this topic by Pierre Luigi, but we are going to be efficient and not replicate anything short of like a just nod to his content. So anyway, and with that, I will let my colleagues introduce themselves.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Leslie Kelly. I'm a senior policy analyst with Voices for Georgia's Children.
I'm not going to move that. And I'm Christopher Pereira. I'm the external affairs consultant for Ser Familia.
I just wanted to thank the chairman and the committee members for giving us this opportunity to present today. Again, as Polly said, a lot of this information has been presented by previous presenters. And so I'm just going to kind of quickly go over some of these statistics and then really kind of focus in on the licensing barriers and the licensing rules and restrictions, and then the barriers that were a little different from what has been already presented. First slide. So as everybody's already talked about, we know that Georgia's Hispanic and Asian populations are growing. Also, this is a national statistic, but the U.S. psychological workforce is not based on race and ethnicity is not keeping up with what the population is. So as some of the presenters previously spoke about, there are healthcare shortages in Georgia. Georgia's registered nursing workforce is not growing as fast as the population is growing. Between 2017 and 2020, there was an overall downward trend in the prevalence of general and specialty practitioners in Georgia. And the pandemic exacerbated already high burnout rates among physical and behavioral health providers.
And so a lot of this information you may already be familiar with, but we're just going to highlight the importance and the relevance of this in our conversations today. So as Georgia's Hispanic community, also my community as a Central American that came to this country, was the firstborn in my family, we've seen an incredible need for behavioral health care during the pandemic. It's spiked significantly, and it's especially, the bandwidth limitations are especially prevalent for providers that are culturally and linguistically competent. And so, of course, we really want to highlight that the number of Hispanic youth in Georgia have disproportionately been impacted in the client base that we serve. And for context, Ser Familia is the largest Hispanic nonprofit by budget in Georgia. We contract with about 17 government agencies. We're the only Hispanic nonprofit of its kind focused on behavioral health. And that means just in 2022 alone, about 7,800 clients from 31 different counties. Currently, we're seeing about 16 mental health screenings a day. So you project about 80 a week or over 4,000 at a year at this rate, just for context. Again, Ser Familia documented that inside the Hispanic community during the COVID-19 pandemic, depression and anxiety significantly increased, domestic violence increased, as well as sexual and physical abuse. I would like to highlight, besides these facts and figures, that a lot of that was due to non-familial units joining in housing for financial reasons or any other kind of emergency. So you had unrelated individuals within the household that contributed significantly to this. And of course, I think a few times we've seen other colleagues here highlight that people who speak a second language many times revert to their language in which they learned their feelings in a moment of trauma or stress. That is even true for me, who English was my first language, but I speak Spanish fluently. Spanish is the language of my emotions. There's a definitive benefit when you're dealing with individuals in behavioral health, being able to treat them in the language they feel most comfortable in. And that's particularly, again, important in trauma and distress. Great. Okay. So again, excuse me, sorry. Georgia's Hispanic population is rapidly increasing, while barriers to licensure prevent expansion of already limited Hispanic behavioral workforce. We are very familiar with that. We've heard about that from multiple communities. Again, I'll remind the chairman and the members of the committee, you may already be familiar with this, but as a reminder, we have about 700,000 Hispanic community residents in the metro region alone. And with a 153% increase by 2040, which means 1 million just in Metro Atlanta alone. The other 300,000 current Hispanic residents in Georgia are typically found again in Dalton, Hall County, some in Middle Georgia, but of course we'll also include our migrant farming communities in South Georgia, just for context. And a very important statistic or metric, the number of licensed clinicians, social workers, counselors, and psychologists who are culturally and linguistically proficient to serve our Hispanic community is estimated between 100 to 125, which that's 1.1 specialized clinicians per 1 million Georgians, but specifically 1 clinician per every 10,000 Hispanic resident. And we've already covered with other individuals here earlier that Georgia requires more supervised hours than any other state in the Southeast for professional counseling licensure. And we think that some supervision requirements can be a barrier to licensure, such as graduates coming from minority communities having greater difficulty completing their licensing due to a lack of financial support from their families. I could say that's true for me in my career. I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for UGA and the Hope Scholarship. Wouldn't be able to testify in this room because it would have been too much of a financial burden to my family. And of course, graduates are not being paid a full salary since they are not fully licensed, and they're incurring the expense of supervision, making it very difficult for them to complete the process.
Okay, so as I previously said, and I believe Polly passed out this full memo, this table that you're seeing right here for the licensing rules and regulations in Georgia is kind of a Reader's Digest version of that. I know that some of the previous presenters, Ms. Lynch and Dr. Mancini, have already gone over some of these behavioral health specialties with all of us, but I'll just really kind of highlight some of the things that they did not touch on. Dr. Mancini spoke about the kind of bundle of counseling, social work, and marriage and family therapist. The way I've kind of designed this table is to look to see if there's a specific licensing pathway for foreign trained professionals. And what I mean by that is, do the Georgia rules and regulations define, acknowledge a specific pathway and tell you how to do it? So for this bundle of licenses, there is no specific pathway for these foreign trained professionals. As far as accreditation for their foreign education, there are 4 agencies that accredit these 3 master's degrees, meaning master's in counseling, and MSW, a master's in marriage and family therapy. And the only education programs that they accredit outside of the United States are in Puerto Rico and Canada. And the only program in Puerto Rico is an MSW program, and the only program in Canada is an MFT. So if you have a counseling degree, there's nowhere outside of the US that would be accredited. And then as far as accreditation for a foreign postgraduate experience, there is no accreditation for that for counseling, social work, marriage and family therapists. And there is no temporary licensure option for foreign trained professionals, again, in this bundle of licenses. The second rules and regulations that we looked at are nursing. So as far as behavioral health goes, this would cover advanced practice registered nurses who were specializing in behavioral and mental health. So there is a specific licensing pathway for foreign trained registered nurses. This is the only licensure that I covered where there is a specific pathway set forth in the rules and regulations. So for registered nurses, their foreign education is accredited. They just have to get their credentials evaluated by the Commission on Graduates of Foreign Nursing Schools, and that commission appears to accredit nursing programs worldwide. And for as far as postgraduate experience, so yes, again, for registered nurses, their postgraduate experience is accredited. And then any additional education experience that is needed for an advanced practice nurse must be verified by, again, that same commission that accredits educations, and then they must pass an exam to become board certified. I put not applicable in the temporary licensure for foreign trained professionals for nurses because they actually do have a pathway. The next field that I looked at, which I don't think anybody has covered previously, is psychology. And there's not a specific pathway set forth in the rules and regulations, but there is a licensure by endorsement option. So the thing to know about this, though, is that in order to be eligible to be licensed by endorsement, you must be licensed in another state. So while there is accreditation for education and supervision in Canada and Puerto Rico, they still must be licensed in another state before they could become eligible for licensure by endorsement. And there is a temporary licensure option for foreign trained psychologists. Again, it's only if they are applying to become licensed by endorsement. And so they have to be licensed in another state to even be eligible for a temporary license. And then Darlene, or Miss Lynch, excuse me, covered the physician licensure rules pretty well. There's no specific pathway set forth in the rules and regulations for the medical board. As far as accreditation for foreign education, yes, all that's really needed is a certified transcript in English or approval by the Federation of State Medical Boards. And then because we are covering behavioral health, I was really looking at a pathway for a foreign trained psychiatrist. So obviously that's a physician with a psychiatry specialty. And there are 4 agencies that accredit psychiatric residencies. And they do cover some residencies in Puerto Rico, Canada, and then 5 other countries. So it is possible if you were educated in one of these countries and got your psychiatric residency in one of these countries, that you would be able to be eligible for the psychiatric exam. And then as far as temporary licensure, the rules and regulations say, yes, it's possible, but it's at the discretion of the executive director of the board. So looking at what some other states have done in the past couple of years to kind of eliminate some of these barriers for these foreign trained behavioral health professionals. As I just talked about, temporary licensure, while working to complete full licensure. So Colorado, Massachusetts, and Missouri have all offered temporary licensure options. Again, very important, these defined pathways for foreign trained healthcare professionals, kind of like what they set forth for the registered nurses. They're doing this in Vermont, Minnesota, and Utah. And then creating a task force or a study committee to explore solutions for all healthcare professions. And obviously that kind of helps you taper your solutions to your own state. And they've done this in Minnesota, Massachusetts, and Vermont. I do understand that these states are far away from Georgia. So some of our recommendations, so building off the work of the 2021 House Study Committee on Innovative Ways to Maximize Global Talent, the work that this study committee is doing, and the Georgia Works Licensing Commission, we'd really like to prioritize the solutions to integrate foreign trained health professionals into Georgia's healthcare workforce. Again, we'd like to see the creation of specific licensure pathways to simplify the process for foreign trained health professionals who are licensed in other countries, including the use of a credential evaluation service to accredit foreign education and supervised experience. And last, we'd like to allow the issuance of temporary licenses for those licensed physicians that don't already offer one, so that foreign trained health professionals can work while they're meeting full licensure requirements, which would again allow them to take care of themselves and their families while working towards licensure.
And so we have a couple of key recommendations that could help Georgia reduce licensing barriers for culturally and linguistically diverse U.S. trained professionals. I'll quickly read them and give you my detailed thoughts, but they creating funding opportunities to allow nonprofits to provide supervised hours at no cost to culturally and linguistically diverse graduates working towards licensing, and assisting with costs associated with relocation and licensure for culturally and linguistically diverse healthcare workers. I'll also add that it's our firm belief that improving a path to licensure for culturally and linguistically diverse U.S. trained professionals increases availability of existing professionals for all Georgians. Everyone benefits by improved access to quality care and by increasing the total number of clinicians capable of serving Georgians of all background.
And I will add, just in case you fall asleep before you make it that far, there is a full chart of the requirements for each of the professions that I covered in this memo. But I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have. Let me know how that goes.
Thank you.
The national data slide, this one,
Yes, sir.
the overserved population by white. How many of those people are fluent in Spanish?
I do not know.
That's my point, is let's not stick this like that.
Sure.
Oh, there it is. Minnesota, Massachusetts, and Vermont. What were their solutions?
There's actually a comprehensive list.
It's in here?
Mhm.
Okay, thank you. That's it. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for your time, Chairman. Thank you.
Oh,
Senator Walker, did you have any questions?
No, I appreciate it. And thank you for your presentation and the detailed information in this handout. So
Okay.
thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, last but not least, and this is we're gonna shift gears here. We've been talking a lot about healthcare. Now we're gonna talk about landscape architecture. Mr. Jay Geller, Advocacy Chair of the American Society of Landscape Architects, Georgia chapter.
Correct.
Good to have you with us.
Thank you.
And the floor is yours.
Well, good afternoon. My name is Sarah Boyer. I am an associate and a landscape architect at Lord X Sargent here in Atlanta, Georgia. I serve as the president-elect to the Georgia chapter of American Society of Landscape Architects. I am a licensed landscape architect in the state of Georgia. So my license number is LA 0018880. I am a resident of Sandy Springs and I'm represented by Senator Josh McLaurin. We just want to thank you guys for letting us come and testify today. A lot of people don't know about our profession, so we would just really like this opportunity to tell you more about what landscape architecture is and why we need to be licensed. I've been practicing for about 10 years here in Georgia and across the United States. I've been able to have an amazing career because of my education. I went to the University of Georgia. We are the largest landscape architecture program in the country, so we produce more landscape architects here in Georgia than anywhere in the country. We, like every profession, is struggling with the workforce, and it only comes from education that you're able to practice landscape architecture. I've practiced, at the Atlanta Beltline, which you're probably familiar with. I've worked at different engineering companies, working on various GDOT projects, and I now work in an architecture firm that did the preservation of the Gold Dome. So landscape architects can be found in a variety of different private businesses, but also in your local municipalities, your state governments, and your federal governments. And then I just want to introduce Jay. Jay is our advocacy chair. He has significant experience explaining like the licensure process of what we go through as landscape architects. And he is a senior landscape architect in Savannah, Georgia.
You said you did the Gold Dome, worked on preservation of the Gold Dome. That's interesting to me. I wouldn't have thought that was a landscape architect.
I work in an architecture firm.
Oh, okay.
Not just landscape architects.
And can I have one more little comment? So I went to the University of Georgia also, go Dogs, and went to, I'm a business school graduate. It's now called the Terry College of Business. It wasn't called that when I was there, but anyway, proud Terry College grad. But there was a building on next to Brooks Hall, Caldwell, and I had a ton of classes in that building, and it was the headquarters, I guess, for the landscape architecture folks. And but I never truly quite understood what y'all do. So
Yeah, I was Caldwell, so I did my first year in the 4th floor and then the 5th floor. And then there was a new building, the old Lamar Dodge School was converted to architecture only building. We were in like 3 different buildings, so they consolidated this into one facility.
yeah, when I was there, Caldwell was brand new. It was the most modern building on campus. It's ancient now. All right, sorry about that.
Fine.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Senator and Chair, for inviting us to come in and speak with you today. My name is Jay Gaylor, Senior Landscape Architect for Coleman Company in Savannah, Georgia. Sorry, I'm a Badger. I'm a transplant from Wisconsin, but I've been here 5 years now. My wife is born and raised Savannah, so that's how I ended up in Georgia. She worked at UGA for 22 years, and I think the first 5 was at Terry College. So you probably ran into Audra somewhere back in the day. Landscape architecture involves the planning, design, management of outdoor spaces. We're not a science, we're not an art. We're kind of a combination of those. We work with the outdoor environment, built environments, natural environments, and cultural environments. Our skill set, we work to improve human environmental health in all of our communities in outdoor spaces. We plan and design parks, campuses, streetscapes, business parks, trails, plazas, residences. I do single family, we do multifamily, assisted living, memory care, senior living, recreational, golf courses. We have a wide breadth of skills that we bring to the table and to the Georgia economy. The scope of services we provide is defined by statute. I think we heard earlier that, oh, what does a landscape architect do? Well, it's defined by Georgia statute. All 50 states regulate the profession of landscape architecture. If I don't have a license, I cannot call myself a landscape architect. And in all but Illinois and the District of Columbia, I could not practice as a landscape architect, which means stamp and seal plan sets. With our unique skill set, we work to improve human and environmental health in all of our communities. We design parks, campuses, streetscapes, trails, plazas, and other projects that strengthen our communities. In Savannah, Coleman Company, we're primarily surveying, civil engineering, but I lead the landscape architecture and planning group. And so we do commercial sites, warehousing sites, industrial sites, single family, multifamily. Some of the projects we work on, Broughton River Streets and Bay Streets revisioning. We work with the city on their Recreation Reimagined program. And right now we're just getting into the 2,000+ acre Radiant development, Belfast Keller and Richmond Hill, which I believe Governor Kemp was there at the opening of that interchange on the interstate. We protect health, safety, and welfare. All 50 states, as I said earlier, regulate the profession of landscape architecture. We apply our skills and knowledge, to plan to design, document, and supervise the development projects that protect and conserve resources and safeguard our communities from hazards. ASLA has also drafted a universal language for licensing so that each state can, when we talk about reciprocity between states, so that facilitates much easier for states. So when people like me move to Georgia, it's much easier to get my license, practice, earn a living. Landscape architects are charged with applying and adhering to numerous zoning codes, ordinances. Locally, I've got tree ordinances to do, but I have zoning codes, setbacks, buffers. I have a lot of local codes and ordinances to follow. Same thing at the county level. State level, we work with Department of Transportation, Department of Agriculture, the Ports Authority. Federal, I've worked with Natural Resource Conservation Service, Soil Conservation Service, Forest Service, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and the list goes on and on. We have so many regulations and governing bodies that we work with that licensing shows that we have demonstrated the ability to carry out the mission of those different agencies of government. The licensure process in Georgia, I was one of the first in Wisconsin. Prior to 1995, we did not have professional regulation. Not too many states did. Through the 90s and early 2000s, the country, ASLA, worked with many states to get professional licensure for landscape architects. We must graduate from an accredited university program. University of Georgia is accredited, University of Wisconsin is accredited. We pass a national registration exam, the Landscape Architecture Review Exam, better known as LARI. We make our application. We do have to have several years of experience prior to being granted licensure. But with most statutes, there is an alternative path to gaining licensure, that if a person does not attend a accredited university, they may work for a specified period under a licensed individual, and they may gain that knowledge and experience by doing that longer term internship. So if somebody says, oh, the cost of getting licensure is so expensive, there is an alternative path. Landscape architecture, I'm on the national committee also for government affairs and state licensure, and we work very, very hard. I worked with the Wisconsin legislature when we've had different repeal, reform, getting our license back in 2010 and 11, that to make sure that our statute was not worded so that it's a fence me in, fence you out type piece of legislation. No, we did want to make people successful and get people licensed. The licensure process by exam in Georgia, right now, it's still a paper process, submitting documents to the Secretary of State's office, and it's very cumbersome. I went through that a few years ago. It took me over a year to get my Georgia license, which really limited what I could do as a practicing professional. I submitted my documents, the check for the fee, and I had my university send transcripts like they're supposed to. I had all my endorsements. It was hard to communicate with the Secretary of State's office. And when I did finally hear back, well, you didn't send your documents in. We didn't get them. And I said, well, you got my check. Well, how do you know? You cashed it. Oh, they misplaced or whatever, because they said, well, we never received documents. Well, I sent them certified mail. I have the receipt with the signature. So what we're asking today is to continue to migrate this system of paper documents to a digital application process and record keeping like most of the rest of the country. If there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer them for you.
So at our first meeting, we had our first meeting in Macon at the
Yes.
Professional Licensing Board office there. And excuse me just a minute, I'm losing my mind here.
Gabe.
Turn your microphone off.
So Gabe Sterling,
Yes, I've met Mr. Sterling.
so he assures us that they are in process of a new system that's modern, digitized, streamlined, going to be very user friendly. Have you discussed this with him, or are you encouraged that that might actually happen? Or
We discussed briefly with Mr. Sterling at the Capitol back in March. He did give a presentation to a joint landscape architecture and the architects AIA. We held a kind of a lunch event with, and Mr. Sterling was one of the speakers. He said, yeah, they have a target of January 2024, and we're hoping they make that. At Coleman Company, I supervise landscape designers. These are people, they've got their degrees, they're working in the field. They have not completed the exam process yet. And I said, you might want to wait until that digital application process is up and running before you make your application for licensure. So I've got 3 people in Savannah that I supervise that. Yeah, we're really looking for that to happen.
so how much education do you have to have? Is it 6 years or?
4-year degree, accredited degree.
And then how much field work?
2 years after, under a registered landscape architect.
That seems pretty reasonable. I've got a real good friend that's a surveyor, and it's very onerous. Like,
Send him our way,
I
please.
think it's 10 years.
I don't know that.
It might be 8, but I think it's 10, 8. Anyhow, that's,
Either way, it's a long time after you've like completed civil engineering.
so that's your ask, is that we modernize the
Yes.
system.
Yes,
Well, that, I hope that's happening.
Okay.
And I,
It won't be January.
Yeah.
yeah.
We're just having we're having other people from other states contact us, as the, state ASLA board, how do I get in touch with them? And they call, no answers. They call, that person doesn't know what information to provide them. So we're just trying to help our community do a little bit better business here in Georgia.
so I take it that neither of you are on the licensing board.
We are
for-
not.
Have
We
you,
have one appointed person to the board, I believe it's John Williams.
Yes.
So, yeah. Who's based in Athens, and he's a practitioner.
and your association gets to appoint him, or,
He's nominated.
Appointed, appointed by the governor's office.
okay. And I'm sure you've been communicating with the people on the board.
Yes, we do.
Do they say it's a resource? Why can't they return phone calls or answer the phone, or,
The board, it's not the board, it's the Secretary of State's office.
and is it a resource issue, or?
Mr. Sterling tells us it's funding and personnel. If they had more of both, they would be much happier.
From like my personal experience, I applied for licensure in 2018. It took about a year to even get approved to sit for my exams. I took my exams in a shorter amount of time than that. I passed. I never heard back that I was issued a license. I found out I was issued a license when the COVID shutdown happened, and I got a notification from the Secretary of State's office about this is what to do during COVID about your licenses. And I was like, oh, I guess I got a license, but I was never informed I was issued a license. And getting a license is really important for us because it affects our pay. So if you pass your licensing exams, your salary goes up. I was about to go on maternity leave, so if I had not been able to have that and provide it to my employer, I could not have gotten my raise before I was gone for 4 months on maternity leave. So those are just kind of the scenarios that we're running into. We're just hopefully, in 2024, we'll have this new digital system,
But you do favor licensing. it sounds
Yes, we
like.
do. Yes, everybody will come in and say that it's to protect health, safety, and welfare. I kind of know from being in Wisconsin, here's before licensing, here's after. And what we learned as soon as our professional practicing license was adopted, signed by the governor in 2011, that communities right away started requiring stamping and sealing and of plans of our work. And it's because when we do that, we take ownership of that project for the rest of our life. We take on all the responsibility for that. The unlicensed landscape designer cannot obtain errors and emissions insurance. The licensed practitioner can, so that if something ever should happen, that the responsibility for that, whatever, falls back on the landscape architect, not on that municipality. They just can't afford to keep paying lawsuits.
One last question. I'll see if Chairman Dugan has anything. What's the workforce situation on landscape architects and the future, the current situation, and then what does the future look like? Are there people entering the field or?
Like Sarah said, University of Georgia is one of the largest. It's a fantastic program. I mean, I have firsthand knowledge of Wisconsin. It's a diminishing program. I think what I hear from students is they want to know that they can graduate a program, get out in the work field, which right now there's very high demand for landscape architecture graduates. Get that license in a expedient, some kind of timeline compared to civil engineering, compared to architecture, compared to what other profession, that they can make that benchmark income and salary, pay off their loans, whatever, but they want to make a good living by, they're going to put the investment in. Right now, yeah, we had to recruit from out of state to bring people into Coleman Company to work as landscape architects. So right now things are looking good for University of Georgia grads in landscape architecture.
most students will have a job before they graduate. We will preemptively hire someone 6 to 8 months before they're even going to graduate. And most kids will have a job before they walk out the door. And we usually can't even fill a spot if we have a job opening. There's just a lot of demand for the type of work we do with parks, trails, streetscapes. People want to be outside. People want to have places to take their children and play. Schools are being renovated. Parks are being renovated. Lots of multifamily. I mean, there's tons of growth in cities. And those places are designed usually by landscape architects.
Okay, thank you.
Just the gentleman that was here briefing before was in the Secretary of State's office over the licensure board when he was trying to get his stuff done. I thought it was funny. You should have talked to him. And if you have people calling in and say you can't get a response, call Senator McClure and have him handle it for you. He likes doing that kind of stuff. So just give it to him. Yeah.
Very good to know. Yes.
With you, it'd be Senator Watson.
Yes. I got a hold of my representative, Jesse Petrie.
Yeah, that's where you messed up, House members. You got to deal with the Senate. So
Y'all work with land architects.
not much. Civil more than landscape architects.
I'm surrounded by civils.
Yeah.
Well, we sure appreciate it, and I'm gonna talk to Mr. Sterling myself, and we'll see if we can't encourage him to do better.
Good. We appreciate that. Thank you so much for your time today. Thank you.
All right. Yes, sir. Good meeting. Thank you for all the participation. Thanks for all the presenters. We have a tentative date for our next meeting. It could change because I'm on another study committee and I think we have booked the same day. But I booked ours first, I think, but so it's October 24th, which is a Tuesday. And my plan is to have it at the Capitol. The other committee that I'm on is Bo Hatchett, Senator Bo Hatchett's. And he's got it scheduled in Augusta, but yeah, it put it down of 10 o'clock on October 24th. It is subject to change, but I'll get that worked out in the next few days. So everybody will have plenty of time. Is there anything else to come before us today? If not, we'll stand adjourned. Thank you.